Hi, Zizaran here, and welcome to a community podcast where I'm joined by Mathil, and we are going to interrogate Chris Wilson on some questions from the community. And yeah, we've tried to select a lot of things that were like popular things. Please remember, like a lot of these things aren't necessarily questions coming from me and Mathil. It's questions from the community. And yeah, thanks to both of you for joining me here today.
You're welcome.
No
Thanks for
worries.
spending the time to ask these questions. I know that it's, a bit of a risk for you guys in case things backfire, but let's do it.
It'll be
No
fine.
backfiring for me, because I'm just going to, right off the bat, I love the game still. It's still very good. Most of this doesn't relate to me, but I will still speak on behalf of some people, and I have plenty I can say about most of the topics, so yeah.
Nice. Well, let's start right into it, and we'll take 3.15 things first. So a lot of things people are worried about is that obviously in the last podcast you talked a lot about exciting things for 3.16 and 3.17, but there is quite a lot of people that aren't necessarily loving a lot of the changes currently here in 3.15. So are there any mid-league changes coming, like more than what we've currently got?
So, as you know, we've released quite a few point patches that have updated stuff in 3.15 so far, including one just yesterday or the day before, which added a bunch of stuff. And there's more coming. None of the really, really big ticket items. And the reason why is because those things require development and testing and so on. So anything we can get in before the end of the league, we're doing it. If it's an easy change, we just get it in a patch. There's no need to hold that stuff off, especially if it relates to Expedition. But there is quite a larger set of work that has to be done for 3.16, and we really don't want to rush stuff out, especially when it requires, changes to stuff that we really should test properly.
So about 315 specifically, people are asking a lot about Spellslinger because there's not that many Spellslinger builds that still work or feel as good to play as they used to. There are like very few, but yeah.
So this is a tricky one. I spoke to several developers, and each time they gave me an answer of like, I'm not sure what's going on with Spellslinger. I found more developers until we got to people who had opinions here. And the things that were pointed out to me were that currently we're seeing about 1 in 160 high-level players is playing Spellslinger, and this is within the bounds of a low to medium popularity endgame build, right? It's certainly possible for people to do well at Spellslinger. Before we increase the mana values, as in when it was in its fully nerfed state, my understanding is one of the first people to do the Guardian kills in softcore was a Spellslinger build, and so we're seeing there is some viability there. We're very aware of the feedback that people think that Spellslinger is not in a good place. If it was in a good place, then they would not be clamoring as loudly as they are for changes. The problem is we don't have any specific builds that we need a set that we have to assess currently. When we test Spellslinger stuff, it appears to work just fine. So either our definition of fine is different, or there's stuff we haven't thought to test. And we have tested a bunch, so if people could inform us as to what builds they expect to work that aren't working with Spellslinger, we can have a look at those and make sure we're on the same page about them.
I think a lot of the thing there is that even lastly, Spellslinger for a lot of people was basically like you get a large amount of quality of life and you're sacrificing other things, like for example, damage for that quality of life. And it ended up for a lot of people being like a leveling build or something that was very hard to work in game. And obviously there were some exceptions of builds that just were very strong. And listing we see people using Io Winter Hydrosphere. But when it was already like that last league, then obviously this is a very big hit to a lot of those builds that were already kind of weak last league.
I understand. It does play into the question of what the bounds should be for popularity of a build, because people talk about build viability and build diversity, right? Like they want it so that there are more variety of builds here. And here we have something being played 0.6% of the time by very in-game characters. Do we want it to be played 10% of the time, right? Because it's kind of one of those things where we feel that buffs that aren't careful to Spellslinger pushes it back up to be incredibly meta. And that's something we're careful about. So having said that, we're open to changes. We just need more information about what we should be changing, because currently the guys are pretty happy with it.
Okay. We have a big... Sorry, go on.
Yeah, well, I was just going to comment on it as well. I mean, I don't think Spellsling is in too bad a spot at the moment. It just took some adjusting to. It still is going to be like a huge amount of quality of life that you have to work a bit harder to get. And ultimately, it is still playable, and there are still lots of builds that will work with it. Just before, I felt it was much more on the side of you can chuck almost any of the current meta stuff into it, and it would be way more comfortable. And it's almost too easy. So I don't know. I think it's still decent. I have only tested it with one or two things, but it's definitely still viable. And I'm not sure if it needs many more adjustments at the moment. We'll just, I mean, people are still putting out builds for it, and also those people that are playing it and putting out builds for it are very much on the side of it being completely fine.
That's good to hear.
Well, we have
But
some,
still, community, if you have additional feedback, do share it with us.
yeah, and we have some things about build viability we'll talk about later and stuff. I'm just trying to like, yeah, it's actually surprisingly organized now, which is nice. So last thing about 3.15, obviously, you guys have been doing a large amount of change with the flasks and stuff like that, and people weren't necessarily happy about where the flasks were, and we're pretty much pianoing just as much as we were before. So a lot of people have been asking if you would publicly reconsider your stance on the flask macro, or doing something like a multi-keybind in-game while the flask system is still being figured out.
So I described some changes on the podcast last week related to Flasks, specifically kind of segregating it between proactive and reactive ones. And as you've indicated, those are coming later and aren't ready now. And so you're asking, if we're not happy with where the Flask system is, will we consider allowing Flask macros and so on? Now, we are happy with the effect that instilling orbs have had on Flasks. The ability to trigger stuff when certain elements or conditions occur, that works, and that's something we're keeping, and that's part of it that we thought was successful. A lot of the other changes we thought were bad, and it was a mistake for us to make many of those in that form, but the instilling stuff did work quite well. In addition, the patch that we released just days ago allows you to very easily control which instilling outcome you get on your flask. So people's first experience with instilling orbs, where it was a complete lottery as to whether you get the outcome you want, and it was a bit of a grind, that's a lot better now. So while we'll keep our options open, we do want to see what people think of the new system before we do any rash changes. And I refer to things like allowing flask macros as a rash change, because that confuses the rules about macros, right? Adding the ability for players to selectively use ones that we deem okay temporarily is probably just going to create bad habits within the community and becomes a gateway drug for larger problems as far as macro use is
Sure,
concerned. So
but
we'd rather keep the rules clear.
macros aside, is there a reason why we can't just do that in-game in the keybind, where you could bind like 1 to your flask 1, 2, and 3, and 2 to your flask 4 and 5?
I think one of the topics that's going to come up a bit with my answers to these kind of questions is that, yeah, we agree that that is a solution, but we would rather do a better solution. And so we're trying to get into a situation where if we think something is better, we do that first before we do something that's easy and fast. And this is one of those cases there. I actually personally pushed for a key binding that would enable you to drink multiple flasks at once on multiple occasions in the past, and the team have raised very good points as to why there are better ways to handle it, and that's a sign of the flask system being broken, and it's better to fix the broken rather than acknowledge it with a keybind that isn't going to go away. So that's my personal view on it. I'm not opposed to that, but I definitely see the argument for us trying to actually fix the problem, which we have good plans for. So I think they'll be okay. And if you're worried about, if people are feeling that installing orbs were not as easy to get as they were hoping, try the new bench stuff that we added. It'll help a bit.
Awesome.
I actually kind of like. I mean, I like the new flask system at the moment. It might sound a bit shilly as well, but I do think it's opened up a lot of different ways to use flasks now. But at the same time, I do think that there's no reason you can't just have an option for people to press all those buttons at once, because people are still playing it that way, as you said yourself. People will still be pianoing flasks and making it so that they can do that. And I don't think there's any real harm in letting them piano them easier. Ultimately, given that you've given these other choices, and I think those other choices are actually pretty, viable, and I've enjoyed pressing my flasks less if I've set it up correctly that way. But then some builds I still do want a piano, and I'm just at the moment not happy with wanting to do that piano because my wrist does get a bit problematic from it.
Yeah, and a macro built into the settings where you can essentially bind multiple keys bind a key to multiple actions is not entirely out of the question in the future, right? There are some things that you may ask that the answer is just a hard no, and this one isn't a hard no, it's just a no for good reasons, hopefully, as opposed to core philosophical reasons.
Right. And I'm guessing part of the reason you don't want to change anything is because you feel like you can't take it back later, or
there's definitely a case of not being able to take stuff back later, yes.
right. can move on to items and loot. Matho, is there anything that we don't have specifically as a question that you want to ask for 3.15?
So is that just relating to like
The current patch,
the
basically.
league?
Yeah.
Current patch to the league. I didn't really
changes
think of anything.
before the next expansion.
Yeah. Okay. So on Baeclast, you were talking about things like Headhunter and Mirror, right? And you were talking about how, oh, every monster can drop that, and that is exciting. So this is to do with like chase items, and I've spent a lot of time on Sunday talking to people and trying to figure out like how to like get this across better. Because when we say chase items, a lot of people don't necessarily mean things like Headhunter and Mirror. Because while those are, like you said, they're great. They feel amazing when they drop, but realistically, I don't think me, Matho, or anyone has ever opened a map thinking like, ooh, this map might have a Headhunter, or ooh, this might have a Mirror. Like they're still very important, but there needs to be like realistic drops that you can like chase down yourself with knowing their drop location. So obviously like boss things are good for that, and then you have things like Chevron's wrappings, right? That's like target farmable through divination cards and stuff like that. But there's very little actual target farming. And I think there's very important to have both in the game. And why do we see so little target farming in Path of Exile, like, Chevron or Comb dropping their own items?
So let's start by defining the word chase, just so we're all using the same terminology for the rest of the podcast, if possible. So I see there's being two definitions of this. I see chase as meaning potentially a valuable item, and I see chase as meaning a targetable item. And I assume we're using the latter, right? We're meaning targetable here.
Yeah.
So there's a specific path you can do to get that item, which is the chase as the verb that you're doing.
Yeah.
As opposed to the meaning that about 50% of people I talk to use, which means chase just means incredibly valuable in the context of like, cracking magic card packs where you're looking for the chase rare being the
Sure.
expensive
But
one in
both are
that set.
important, even if the valuable thing is something you can target farm. Both are very important.
Yeah, I understand. But in this case, when you refer to a chase unique, you mean something where you can increase your odds above the baseline by doing a certain action,
Yes.
like killing a specific boss or playing in a specific area.
Yep.
Okay, so I want to talk about the history of action RPGs for a little bit, going back to Diablo 1 and 2. They had very small biases with treasure classes that enabled you to find uniques at a slightly higher rate. If you wanted a wind force, you'd look at the treasure class rate and you'd work out that maybe, and this is me failing to remember, but maybe Pendleskin was a good place to get wind forces from. Maybe you didn't want to do barrel runs for that. I forget. Some people know. And so there was a way that you could slightly increase your odds of getting certain uniques, but this was almost a placebo. Like, it's like changing it from 1 in thousands to 1 in a different number of thousands, if you see what I mean. It's not a significant improvement. And for the record, I don't mind this. I made an argument while preparing for the podcast to the team that we could do exactly that, of having it so that certain monsters had biases towards certain uniques. They'd be small biases and almost entirely psychological. And, nothing came of this. The answer is, well, it's not really changing anything. I'm like, well, I understand it's not really changing anything, but it makes it feel like you're doing some degree of chasing. Anyway, so that aside, that's kind of the history of how those items, like the biases for bosses in Diablo 2 worked. Now, there were specific rewards that you could get, like Annihilus Charms and Hellfire Torches and so on, and there was a specific, basically almost a quest chain of stuff you had to do, in order to get that, and that's cool, and we do have bits and pieces like that in PoE. But this is in comparison to a game like World of Warcraft, for example, where they specifically have, these are the drops that this boss has, and it's all planned out. And that's generally not how action RPGs have traditionally worked. And while we have been introducing those concepts into PoE quite a lot, honestly, by how most action RPGs work, we're staying as close as possible to there is a game that will give you random drops, and the random drops may help you in different ways. It's a philosophy that's present in our crafting, for example, how we're leaning as much as we can on random crafting outcomes rather than deterministic ones. And we're happy to experiment and have a deterministic element to drops and a deterministic element to crafting. But at its core, we're on this 0 to 10 scale, we're sitting there at a 2 or a 3, and a lot of people would really like us to be at an 8 or a 9. And I suspect that's just going to be a key difference between it. And it's also one of the ones that we really don't want to move on, because we actually believe the game is more fun this way. Like, we genuinely believe that if we made the changes of having pretty much everything be targetable in some way, that it would be a worse experience for players.
It's not necessarily everything being targetable, it's just a few things here or there. Like, just to think of like something you could target chase back in the day, or even still now, like Shaper Hideout. it's pretty rare, right? And people can do like 100 runs and still not get it. But every single time you're doing one, you might have that slight inkling of I can get it, and then it's really exciting when there's a payoff. And I think that still could be a thing for a lot of bosses, or even something like the Skyforths was, targetable by high level maps because it was like gated by only the highest tier maps. And that type of item has just, gone away, or that type of farm has really kind of gone away. And I
So
think
we do get that, and we're happy to try to reintroduce that kind of thing, right? Like generally speaking, what you're describing seems pretty harmless to us,
Mhm.
and is a positive thing. And like for the record, like look at Headhunter, right? Let's say you want to target farm a Headhunter. You're right; it could drop randomly from anything, but you can absolutely farm specific maps, and we see people doing it. There's a bunch of people that are specifically farming maps for the div card to get Headhunter. Like if I say to you, your goal is to get one as quickly as possible without trade, there will be a method you can do to increase your chances due to the presence of div cards. And then another side issue here is the concept of like, there are cases where we do take a drop and put it on a boss. Now, we don't want that drop to be super common. We still want it to be valuable, and valuable means rare, but targetable. Like uniques drop by, say, the Ultimatum Trialmaster or All or something like that. And so what do? Well, we either have it so that the boss spawns frequently and the item is incredibly rare to get, or we have it so it's actually attainable from the boss, but the boss doesn't spawn. It requires some effort to get to. And then it causes the complaints about RNG gating. Like it's been very common for us to take something, make it quite targetable, and then there's accusations of RNG gating around that, which we're conscious of, and we understand there's frustration there. So we're trying to hit a middle ground of making sure the content itself is somewhat accessible and that the items are also appropriately rare. But at the end of the day, we don't want chaseable or targetable to mean incredibly common, because the items people want are the best items in the game. And if the best items in the game are trivial to obtain, then the game is broken.
So, specifically with things like you recently moved all the things like Brass Dome, Memory Vault, etc., away from the Elder and Shaper Guardians. That was like for a lot of people like a bit of a surprise because it is a good thing when the quadruple can drop exciting things because in like 3.13, 3.14, if you were just doing a map and it didn't have something like Nemesis, it couldn't drop like anything that would be considered cross league back then yeah, there were very few exciting things that could drop. But now, by taking them away from like the Shaper Guardians, the Elder Guardians, etc., they are like complete. Like now, you can't target farm them at all. Is there a reason for why it has to be like so one way or the other and not both?
I get the point, and that is something we've been discussing internally quite a bit. So it may change in those cases, right? We've heard the feedback that people in some cases preferred how it worked before, and that's something we're open to discussing. So, the team are very aware of it, and you may see some change on that. I'm not sure yet.
Right. Um, and same with like divination cards, right? That seems like a great idea for something like target farming, where you can use that as a pity mechanic. Something that I think is like sort of devaluing a lot of items right now. And you pointed this out on Baeclast. You were like, Chevron's wrappings, it used to be a chase unique. Obviously, it's gotten nerfed a little bit with the energy shield. But like you said, it does pretty much the same thing as it always used to do. And it used to be 100 exalts, then 20, and now I believe it's 40 chaos, right? Without the what the item does having been changed. And obviously now it's just like a lot more accessible. It is fairly rare as a drop, but you can like very, very easily farm it down with div cards. And I would say for things like Chevron's wrappings, that is a good thing because it is a build enabling unique. But there are quite a lot of things that maybe shouldn't be that is getting devalued by boss drops dropping from diviners or stacked decks. Is that something you guys are happy with, or
With divination cards, the only thing we don't get to pick is what the item is, pretty much, right? Like the community come up with what the item is, and we have to choose all the other factors. And so they generally want to pick the most valuable and rarest items in the game. I mean, how many div cards are there for Headhunter now, if you see what I mean? There's a
right?
few. So they pick the hardest item in the game, and we say, okay, so we have a choice. Have they just voted that they want easy access to this item which is intentionally difficult, intentionally valuable, intentionally enabling really powerful builds that you have to work towards, intentionally being aspirational reward?
Mhm.
And so the answer is, of course, we don't want it to be too common. And so we pick values to increase the drop rate of it by roughly double, right? If someone introduces a div card, our goal is that there are now twice as many of that item occurring in the economy or whatever. And we put it in obscure places, we require large stack sizes, we make it drop infrequently because you have to in order to not have the thing be incredibly common. Otherwise, the price crashes down to nothing and people get insane access to a really good build. Which, of course, happens occasionally. There's some cheap stuff that really does enable builds, and that becomes the meta, and that's cool. But we can't do it routinely, as a div card means everyone gets this item. And so, because of this, we have a lot of div cards that are relatively incompletable, and the stacked deck issue is a little bit of a different thing. That's the case of it just being a really compelling reward to give out that people have responded well to. Many of our staff believe that we are giving out too many of those, right? Like, I agree with the feedback that stacked decks they become a bit of a crutch as far as reward systems go because they're just a pile of dopamine that's somewhat valuable and feels good. It's basically a generic unique splinter to some extent. And I'm not saying we're stripping these out or anything, I'm just saying there's unhappiness about that situation and exactly the sentiment that you're sharing. But we do want div cards to be a system that enable target farming of interesting stuff. Like the fact that shavs can be farmed with some effort is a positive thing. I agree. I like that. But to some extent, because there's such a top-heavy skew towards most div cards being for insanely valuable uniques with double corruption on or whatever, it does mean that they generally have to be relatively unobtainable.
Yeah, stack decks do seem like a bit of an issue these days, I think, because there's so many div cards out there nowadays, and you'll probably never see them just naturally. And yet, stack decks give you this like taste of maybe you'll see it, and or you might see it and then go, oh, how do I finish this? And chances are it's impossible that you finish it. And kind of brings me to some other point of, is there any like plan to ever like reduce the sort of bloat of div cards because there's got to be like 1,000 in the game right now or something, and so many of them are useless, and there's just too much for storage. Like you have to buy a div card tab these days, right? You can't do it free to play. So like, are we ever getting rid of some, or is it just going to keep compounding until there's more and more and more?
Well, the tricky thing is div cards are paid for by supporters, right? Each one represents money that someone's paid to help the game. And if we say, okay, cool, we're cutting out 25% of the div cards we don't like, that hate mail that we'll get, the lawsuits or whatever, would be well deserved, right? Like there'll be people who are saying, pretty much you have to give me my money back on that one. And fair enough, right? Like they've bought a
Hmm.
thing which in some cases, like if we had a real problem with a div card, if there was a specific one that we said this can't exist anymore, we'd go back to the supporter and we'd say, hey, look, you get another free card. Come up with a new thing. Is basically what we'd have to do. But that doesn't reduce the pool count. It just means we can gradually adjust it, and in a way which still burns some goodwill. But we did stop selling div cards a while ago. Like we said, look, this is already covering a lot of the items. We want to reevaluate. It is getting quite spammy, and so it's been a while since we've sold any. And I think since April, and we currently don't have any plans to return it in its current form. So the people who already have div cards have contributed to the game in this way, and we're still trying to work out what the right place for them going forward is. But it's content that represents quite a lot of, like cool community creation and funding for the game, and so we don't want to remove it from the game entirely. I'm pretty sure div cards will be there forever in some form.
Do you think they're overall doing what they intend to be doing, like give you a way to target farm certain things? Because I feel like a lot of them are just like, I don't know where 99% of the div cards drop, and I don't feel like I have a chance of finishing a lot of them ever, unless we're, dedicating our entire life to farming that one card. So do you feel they're doing what they're like originally set out to do?
I think the mid-band ones do a pretty good job. I think the really spammy ones, where you need a bunch of them to get some really trivial item, they're kind of implicitly worthless, but the person wanted that. And I think the ones that are entirely unobtainable, like it's impractical to expect you'll get a headhunter, those ones are also somewhat, not in a great place. But the
Mhm.
mid-band ones you can actually use, I mean, like humility farming, right? That's a really popular
Mhm.
activity. And that kind of thing, that type of behavior is something that is serving a purpose in the game. So those ones are great, but we weren't able to control where people were pitching their cards. To some extent, if you're being cynical about it and everyone hates splinters, these is another 1,000 types of splinters, right? So yeah, there are certainly drawbacks to it, but it's been very interesting and informative as a game design exercise.
So specifically going back to like boss uniques and stuff like that, right? There's a divination card from Starforge, and that drops from, for example, a Baeclast, right? Which is pretty rare. Has a decent drop rate, so if you are actually farming beyond and farming that, like you could technically get quite a few cards from that. Um, but I think something that's very strange is that just because of the sheer amount of people playing, for example, softcore trade league, which the game generally seems to be balanced around, you can get a Starforge very early in a league just from stack decks and diviners. And I think on a lot of uniques from bosses, that ends up being what devalues them and makes bosses less special. Obviously, part of
Mm.
that problem is also Starforge not being particularly good right now. But have you guys talked about maybe rebalancing or reorganizing what can actually drop from stack decks and diviners to like make sure the bosses are unique and special in Path of Exile?
Yeah, it's a topic that's coming up, and I don't know for a fact that this is the case. I think it is, but I haven't fact checked this particular thing. But I'm pretty sure that stack decks and diviners are the type of game things that cause a bias towards slightly rarer outcomes. Like, here's an example. Let's say you're killing a boss to find a unique, right? And there's a rate that you're going to get a unique, and there's a rate you're going to get a rarer unique, and so on all the way up. With, say, gambling and expedition, I know for a fact that biases, and we've improved this bias now, to bias towards rarer uniques. So normally, if your odds are getting a Kalm's Harter, I don't know, 1 in 10,000 of a generic unique or something, now it's going to actually be quite a lot more common. And so we intentionally take the odds and make the odds higher for the rarer stuff. Like, there are 1,000 times more headhunters coming out of Gamble because of those improvements we've made to try to make it actually obtainable. And I'm pretty sure that stack decks, I haven't checked it, but I'm pretty sure they do the same math, where it improves the chances that you get rarer div cards by a bit from stack decks. This contributes to the problem you're talking about, where because stack decks are actually really fun because you can get good stuff from them, it causes the good stuff to be devalued. And so the trick is like walking the line between there is a fun game element that people love and making sure the rewards that they're getting feel valuable and compelling. The
Sure.
ideal situation is you get what you want and no one else gets what they want. And I don't mean that in a rude way. It's what every player is going for, where they get some item and then no one else has that item and the person feels special for having it. And so we're trying to find ways that each person can individually achieve that. My concern, though, is if we just rip all the stack decks out, then there's a lot of the immediate rewards from content that suddenly feels quite hollow. So we'd have to have some other thing to replace it with.
But that's very, very extreme, though. There's a happy middle ground there where there are a lot of exciting divination cards that are either like random drops or, like, for example, like Chevron's Wrappings, Exalted Orb divination cards, and items that maybe don't either have a targetable location or something like that. Like, I'm specifically talking about like Disfavor, Starforge, Dying Sun, like those things.
Yeah, I understand. This is a larger topic that our team need to have a look at, but I make sure that they watch the podcast so they'll get the different opinions, especially with the context of chat, because chat says don't remove the fun, which is an important lesson as well.
Yeah, of course. Of course. Like, it's very, very important to have in the game. I just, yeah. Um, and speaking of like good unique items and stuff, currently right now we see several bosses in Path of Exile that don't necessarily have a good loot table. Like Cyrus, most people are pretty happy with like the uniques and stuff from that. Obviously, some people are unhappy with the Awaken Orb nerf, but Azir's Disfavor is generally like a lot worse than like say I have a character that would actually use a weapon similar to Disfavor. By the time I can kill Uber Aziri, you'd pretty much always have a better weapon than that. So, are we going to see like more boss loot like Cyrus? Because recently it's been more things similar to like Maven, which a lot of the loot has been fairly unpopular and not well received.
So when I was preparing for this type of question, we spent quite a while looking at the relative economic values of the different drops and their probabilities from the different bosses, just to sanity check this stuff, which is a thing we do from time to time. And it was quite interesting because you're completely right that the average value of what you're getting from Cyrus relative to difficulty is better than Maven. But a lot of this is situationally based on meta. His uniques are popular right now, therefore they're expensive. Maven ones aren't used necessarily in builds, but could be, and are therefore cheaper. Now that doesn't mean that's in a great place necessarily, but we have to be careful because if there is a unique that becomes popular, its value spikes from trash to several exalts, and that increases the value you get from farming the boss. And if we're sitting there tuning the drop rates of items behind the scenes in response to the market value to keep it flat constantly, like basically meddling in the economy, which is something we generally don't do, then that's going to cause problems where people feel that anytime there's some interesting, valuable reward, GGG just turns down the knob on that one immediately. So philosophically, we do investigate the value of the stuff to make sure it's compelling, but we don't react to get rid of the good value places and to buff up the bad value ones so quickly. Now, it's absolutely worth noting that Disfavor is in a terrible place right now relative to the difficulty of the content. I completely agree with that example, right? We need to do something about that. There's
And
also a supply and demand element to this, right? Right now, Cyrus is a better use of your time than Maven, according to the math that we've shown there, right? So people will kill Cyrus a lot, they'll get a lot of his uniques, and they become cheaper. And they kill less Maven, so her uniques become more expensive, and it does balance out to some extent. Now, I understand in practice, probably still better to kill Cyrus, but in theory, there are market forces that will cause it to equalize over time, right? People can choose what to spend their time on and what rewards are being generated. And we're kind of like, as far as item progression in the game, we're wanting this thing where you start off upgrading your items from white to blue to rare. They sit on rare for a while till you find the good uniques to enable your build. And then ideally, you can find effects on incredibly good endgame rare items that that are more useful for you than those uniques. You sit on those good uniques that are build enabling plus a combination of regular rares for quite some time, but the absolute pinnacle characters have really special rares. And there are mechanics that you can get from these bosses that enable the crafting of those or the transferring of influence mods and so on. And to some extent, those are more important for endgame character progression than merely adding to the supply of special uniques that come from that boss. So there's a bit more to it than just the value of the uniques because of the crafting items that can come from that pinnacle content as well.
so, specifically for the Maven, did you guys think about having her drop elevated rares occasionally?
I don't know if that was discussed as a option for her. I'd have to talk to the team, but they're pretty happy with where Maven is. Like meta-wise, we'd like a few more of her uniques to be useful, and that's being evaluated. But the currency she drops is expensive as well. And one thing to bear in mind with Maven is like the whole end game. Its days are numbered because we are working on new stuff for 317. So who knows if she'll exist in 6 months?
I think just dropping the elevated like rares would be a bit too strong. But currently, I think the main displeasure for most people is that some of those items really are quite unusable. You say maybe if there's a meta shift or they do have their spot if people want to use them. They're in the current version of the game, they're pretty unusable, and that's like 3 out of the 5 total drops or something. So they either need some sort of revamp there, or for that meta to shift pretty drastically for them to be worth anything.
Fair enough.
Yeah. I think a little bit is that whenever you guys put downsides on items, you've maybe overestimated how powerful the item it is, and the downside might be a little bit too hard to get around.
Yeah, unique items are meant to have downsides, so they're not just superior to rares. But I understand if the
Yeah.
balance is off, then they're trash.
What about Awakened Gems? They saw a very, very big change. Are you guys happy with where Awakened Gems are now? Obviously, the biggest example is Awakened Hexproof. Went from being something people would love, like really, really chase down, and it is now 40 chaos, for example. And it just doesn't really do as much for the build. Whereas obviously you talked about in the past how that you guys wanted gems to be like different and exciting to use.
Yeah, the team are keen to add some power back to Awakened Gems, and so the intention is that we're going to be putting a bunch of power back on the level 5 versions of them, so it's a matter of finding the difficult to get gem and then also leveling it up to the top before you get some of that power. They also want to add new Awakened Gems that do more than just damage. Like this philosophy of us trying to make sure that utility support gems are interesting, they want to bring back some powerful ones that are utility rather than pure damage to give players more options there. So there's a bit of discussion internally for Awakened Gems at the moment that's quite exciting.
So why were they targeted to begin with, though? Awakened Gems, like as part of this sweeping nerf, like there was lots that you could have nerfed and lots you did nerf. Why were Awakened Gems also, which were a pretty recent addition to the game, all things considered, that were doing a certain unique aspect for the end game progression?
One of the reasons was that we made Awakened Gems in a hurry close to ExileCon under extreme time pressure, and there were judgment calls made there which other people would not have made later. And so we kind of sat on that for a while thinking, what are we going to do about these? But it was only during a big rebalance at 315 that we really could actually make those changes. And like with some of the changes in 315, people think it went too far. And so there'll be some recovery of power in that case. And this has helped that there's been community feedback on that as well. So a number of factors, half of which are mistakes, have led to this situation.
Yeah, the main feedback like I had initially was that it was like a lot of them just turned into glorified level 21s for like other gems. It was just like a few percent increase, and it almost didn't feel worth converting to. So yeah, just a bit more uniqueness about them.
Another thing that very quickly after being implemented got changed was the alternative quality gems, which probably one of the best parts of Heist. Um, it felt a lot like they got nerfed just because of the existence of Aurobots. So it's sort of the perception for a lot of people is almost like because Aurobots exist, all the alternative like divergent gems and etc. got nerfed very very hard. Are you happy with the current state of alternate gems?
This is something I haven't discussed with the team recently. I remember them talking about the nerfing, and I can't remember if it was the same philosophy as Awakened Gems or not, so it's something I need to check
Right.
with the guys to find out exactly why. A lot of these balance discussions don't happen with me in the room. I try to catch up on it, but this is one in particular that I wasn't involved in. Not that I ever contribute anything, I just make sure I understand so I can explain it, but this particular one, I know nothing about.
Okay.
I think they are kind of still okay. As long as the Aurobot builds exist and work, then I think they're mostly fine. Like, for example, I did some heists yesterday. I found an Aura gem that increases your, like, crit multi by 1% or something. So, to the average user, absolutely worthless. But
Mm.
if an Aurobot can still utilize that, then it's still okay. And there's still, like, more than enough interesting alternates that justify the entire system, I think.
Yeah, we're very aware of the Aurobot situation where there's a lot of community outcry for us to do something about that, and this is something that's currently on the list for 316. Hopefully it stays on the list. There's some interesting new some skills being developed which are kind of meant to be a more game-friendly way of doing support characters, and they may not make it in. I have to emphasize that these are early prototypes, but it's looking positive and looks like it'll be a lot more fun and interactive. So we'll see where that goes.
Awesome. Yeah, I would definitely like make sure you guys do continue talking about it because I kind of disagree a lot with what Mathel said that there's a lot of useful ones. They
Go on,
were
please. My entire chat just said you're really mad. I'm not sure I picked up on it, but
no,
let me
it's
have it.
just I would very much disagree with that because like they were when they came out, but like yeah, like you said, more than not do feel like oh yeah 1% more damage, excellent. Whereas when they
Yeah,
first came out, they were like a very very unique and it changing thing. So it's sad to see that go away.
but I'm saying if that 1% more damage is still like useful for those Aurobots, isn't it still in an okay spot?
But I guess that's the entire problem in my opinion. Like I don't like it's great to have a build like Aurobots for the game where you really, really invest into build. I think that's very important. Like in stackers, strength stackers. I personally and from like talking to people on Sunday, Aurobots because of them quote unquote destroying alternate gems for the rest of builds are kind of bad.
Okay.
I'll make sure my Aurobot team discuss that.
Nice.
Sorry, I got the
Aurobot team.
concept of an Aurobot team from chat. It's great.
Oh, that's nice. That's awesome. I'm trying not to read chat in case I'm upsetting a lot of people.
It makes the whole experience a lot more surreal
I bet.
to find
Um,
out 10 seconds later whether you screwed up.
yeah.
Yeah, no, it's not good. I closed mine down for a bit and then I reopened it because you got to see what's happening, but I don't think it lets you focus enough on what you're saying. And
Yeah, I'm trying to focus and just stick to the questions because it's uh if we get through all of it, that represents quite a lot of different parts of the community.
Yeah, there are a lot of questions and they are quite diverse, which is good. I appreciate you taking into account everyone's opinions when putting it together.
Yeah. I think only like 3 of these were mine. So that's good. Um,
0 of these were mine.
you actually said you well didn't have anything to add. You said you liked a lot of them.
I added some of the stuff that was already kind of there, basically.
Yeah.
So,
Okay. Harvest has
oh
been
boy.
very, very contentious. Obviously, a lot of people are talking a lot about Harvest. And I remember something really stood out to me that you said on Baeclast, and that is when people get perfect items, they generally quit, right? And I saw a lot of people were not necessarily very happy about what you said there. But I do think there is a point in what you said, but it's slightly different. It's whenever people get to the point where they don't feel like they have a reasonable upgrade, then they quit. And that point is different with a player like Nugi, with a player like Mathil, or with a casual player. But it's always important for a player to feel like they have an immediate upgrade in sight. And that is why Harvest was so amazing in the original state. It was actually for a large part of the community, because drops right now, like, you pretty much outside of the first week, you aren't finding a drop. Nearly every item you use is crafted. That's like pretty much always that case. And most of the community weren't crafting perfect items. Like, they weren't crafting these perfect items and quitting. Um, so I'm wondering, have you guys there's a couple of things about Harvest with where a lot of people aren't happy with it. And one thing that feels particularly bad is if you see, for example, you're fighting like Blister Lords or Divination Card Beasts, but you aren't getting their craft. Right? You'll see like the Reforge Influence Beast, 4 of them, 5 of them, and fighting them, but you're not getting the craft. Is that something you're happy with? Like the fact that it's all like percentage based and you're still fighting them?
When you find a patch of monsters, when you find a patch of plants, as it were, you can see what crafts you're going to get. So you can't see whether you're getting Blister Lords yet, but you do know I'm getting a Blister Lord craft, or none, or several, and that's a random outcome, but you can see what it is before you lock it in. And so you should make an assessment between the patches. Then you fight a group of monsters, and it may be that there are more Blister Lords than crafts, but that's because they're percentage based. And the reason why is you get 23 monsters in a patch, and having to do 23 crafts multiple times whenever you encounter Harvest is ages and ages of tons of crafting that would otherwise be wasted. And so when we were rebalancing this, we wanted to make sure that the rarer ones occurred slightly more frequently, but there were fewer crafts overall that you're getting. That way you actually see some of the better ones occasionally. But there is a disconnect between how many of a specific monster you get and how many crafts you get of that type. You do see them in advance. So yes, it does suck if you have a patch that includes no Blister Lord crafts, but then when you do the fight, there's some hard monsters in there. But that's just the random fight you're getting for the crafts that you have picked. As for the point about the progression of upgrading items, I completely understand that if a player has no feasible upgrades left, then there's no ability for them to improve their item, and that's the same as them having a maxed out item. They don't think it's getting any better, and then they have less incentive to play. If enough of their items are like that, then there's no reward for them to fight. An important thing we have to do in Path of Exile is to make sure that there are incremental upgrades, and the system of diminishing returns is used in action RPGs for this kind of thing. Whenever you reroll, if you're starting with really bad items off the ground and you reroll them, it's easy to get ones that are marginally better. You can improve them. The amount of effort it takes to do each improvement gets higher and higher and higher. It's like leveling up after 80, right? It starts taking longer and longer and longer. And this spacing is appropriate for endgame because players implicitly understand with games that it takes slightly more effort to reach each thing. It's kind of a logarithmic scale. Now, that scale is a bit whacked at the moment in Path of Exile. There are a lot of reasons why you can just jump massively far ahead of the scale right to the really hard part. It's like if you suddenly level up from level 80 to level 98, you're suddenly saying it's taking so long to level at this point, I quit. And so that's kind of happening with items. Now, if you want the experience of how it's meant to work in a really pure system, try the hard mode thing I was talking about last week. It will really illustrate the item progression stuff, which is the point we're trying to make with that. But in the core game here, one of the reasons why Harvest, and I'm purposely not reading chat here, even though it's going crazy when I mention hard mode.
Yeah, I
Is
figured.
there a bingo card again? Great. Anyway, one of the things with Harvest here is we don't want to allow people to get too far ahead of that item curve, and we're bearing that in mind with the changes we're making to it. But we get the feedback from players that people don't think Harvest is in a great place, and so we're going to have a look at it, right? Like for 3.16, we'll do a review of things. This is not going to be major, like we're not restoring it back to how it was before,
Sure.
but we'll have a look at the different costings and weightings and rarities and just make sure that it's good. But bear in mind, we're treating this as a premier, top-tier, powerful crafting system that's already in a dangerous place here. Like the goal is not to make it significantly more powerful. It's already a dangerous part of Path of Exile. At this stage, we're not discussing removing it. We do think it serves a really good purpose, and it's something players can look forward to that does provide some deterministic crafting. It's just really dangerous, and we want to be careful because people think that they want a shortcut to get the best stuff, but that takes away a lot of the progression of actually building stuff up, in a reasonable way. And it contributes to the problem where there's no point in looking at items that are on the ground because they're averaging a 3 out of 10, and your crafting quickly gets you to the 8 or 9, and everything's squished up there in terms of getting the best items in the game.
But that's like a large problem for a lot of people. There's already very little reason to look at stuff on the ground. You are never going to compete with anything crafted because like there's no such thing in Path of Exile, or there's very little like drop only modifiers, right? Like I think the community have a very positive reception to things like the veiled buff, right? Because they can be very special and they are drop only. So yeah, you can actually find a really, really special veiled modifier, but you're never going to identify a really well crafted influence item, and this like it's just never competing with crafted things ever, pretty much. Like there is virtually never a point where players are going to pick up an item, identify it, and find upgrades from that. Very little.
Hmm. Yeah, and that's something that we're going to get fixed long term. It's not an instant thing, right? Like if we just make it so the ground drops insanely powerful stuff next expansion, then people will feel that the crafting options are terrible. We have to make sure that there's an interplay between the two systems, right? You're finding some things on the ground that are either upgrades or good bases, and then there's a way to interact with it with crafting. And crafting can't necessarily make the best stuff in the game, but can augment it.
Right.
And we have a plan here, and I think that a lot of the learnings we're getting from hard mode are instrumental here, because that's a case of us taking everything out and then seeing how it actually functions. And it's remarkable how certain crafting systems in Path of Exile are pretty optional these days. Now that doesn't mean we're changing it in the core game. We understand there's significant political problems with doing that. But yeah, it's really interesting to see how a comment someone made internally recently was, it's a testament to the strength of this item system that it's been so butchered over the last 30 expansions, but still works pretty well. And so that's something that we are very aware of, that itemization is not in a good place.
Right. Okay. Um, Looping back to Harvest before we move on to other things, like that obviously there was a very multi-pronged nerf on Harvest. With obviously you can no longer use like augments or the annul augments at all on influence gear. Um, are you guys happy with how like that ended up happening with like everything at the same time? Like, are, are you specifically happy with how rare augments is now? Like, I, me, and quite a lot of other players that play an extreme amount have never found one. So that makes it like very demotivating for, because how is an average player ever going to find one?
Get lucky.
I'm happy with the rates. I think Harvest is already too gifty personally, but I'm making sure to not have my view be 100% of the view in the office on this. There are some people who certainly are much more pro Harvest than I am. Even though I created this problem in the first place by saying, guys, I want the most powerful crafting system the game has ever seen, let's ruin it, basically, is kind of the spec of that experiment, which was a big mistake. But yeah, I'm fine with the current rarities in Harvest. I get the fact that some things are quite rare, but we would rather have them rare and possible than not possible. Like when we were designing the new Harvest, the question was, okay, let's remove all of that. And we had a think, wait, no, we should have it be aspirational. We can put some stuff in there that occurs very infrequently. And so we'd rather have those annul ones present than completely removed entirely. I mean, the other options have them be really common, but then that's only making the item problem worse.
Sure. I think a lot of the thing that ends up feeling bad for players right now, that quite a lot of people brought up as a point, is that it's the only really deterministic way to craft items right now. So if you find something where it's like you have a almost 0% chance of like using a normal exalted orb, right, or like a Leo research exalted orb to slam the item, a lot of people end up just sitting around with their item waiting for harvest that never appears, so the item is just rotting in their stash because there is nothing comparable to it. It ends up feeling so bad.
So this is a communication problem. We have a situation where a person says, I have an item that could be improved by this thing, but this thing is incredibly rare. And so they're planning around a thing that's unlikely to actually occur. It's very much like if you like rig your life so everything's perfect if you win the lottery tomorrow. That's a poor decision because you're probably not winning the lottery on the exact day that you want to. And so we probably need to communicate better that there are very rare aspirational outcomes there. It's like having your league starter be a headhunter build and then be somewhat annoyed about the fact you don't get one in time. And I know I'm being a bit facetious here, but I think the problem isn't make these insanely powerful crafts really common so that people's items rotting in the stash can be improved, but more a matter of making sure people understand that these are quite unlikely outcomes for them to get.
Well, I think the problem isn't that it's just not like really common. The problem is it's insanely rare. Like you can't realistically hope to find it at the moment. Lots of people have just straight up forgotten these things exist and thought they got removed or completely nerfed. So I'd say there still needs to be a bit of a tweak on numbers for like some of the augments or whatever you've left in, because you took a lot out. So if you're leaving Harvest the way it is, like as a mechanic, it probably still needs a few number tweaks. And other main gripe I'd say is it's just a bit hard to like count on harvest as a system right now because it's currently in a couple of locations and it's RNG to get it basically, but it's so far and away best for crafting a few things that you have to just run maps and hope for it to happen. Otherwise you feel like an idiot for going to some other crafting system because it's so much worse to do for a few items. So I think it would be better to have it be a bit more targetable or like usable in the system that it currently is in, because it just, yeah, I don't know, makes you feel weird about using the other crafting systems.
Yeah, I mean, there's some degree of targetability because it's present in the Atlas trees, of course, you can specialize there. And that is getting changed a bit in 3.16 as we reduce the number of regions and change so it's simpler trees and so on with less duplication. And then again in 3.17, as we change the end game, that may involve different ways of specializing so that you can target them more potentially. But one thing to bear in mind is this is already a system that's incredibly powerful. We have to be careful to make sure that it isn't just incredibly freely available as well. Like having to be something to work towards is good. The point you were making about the values of how often the special crafts occur, there's a bit of a situation here where I'll sit here philosophically and say, nah, it should be rare. I don't know what the numbers are. I can't tell you how rare it is, right? My team will look at the numbers, and despite me going, we're keeping this rare, it's got to be rare, they'll look at the numbers and go, yeah, okay, cool, and make it 4 times more common because that's the right number, right? So I'll sit here and defend this, and chat will say it's a trash answer and so on, and then the team will go and fix it because that's their job and they're good at it. I'm just making sure to represent the goal that we're trying to achieve. And our numbers could be wrong. We could have it 4 times rarer than it should be, and they'll come and fix it, and it still remains appropriately, well, it still remains relatively rare. Most players won't see it, but it's possible.
Right. A lot of people are asking, is it possible to make Harvest tradable similar to Bestiary, maybe with a cost? Because right now you have a large portion of your community that are forced to use third-party tools like Discord to trade.
Okay, so let's discuss this one. This is a good one. Currently, when you encounter a rare craft, you have some ability to save it in an annoying way, and some ability to trade that with other people in an annoying way, in a way that they're scamming, and it's basically a lot of counterparty risk, and it's very frustrating, right? So there's a nod to the ability to save and trade stuff in there. We haven't tried to make it entirely restricted to one character. But the question is, why don't we make it so that it's easy to trade? Why don't we make it so when you find it, it's a special harvest currency item that you pull out of the window that you can then trade for 15 exalts because it's valuable? So what currently happens is, when people find relatively valuable crafts, a lot of them don't even notice. A lot of them forget about it, or store it and then never use it. A lot of them don't understand what it's for. There are many of these crafts that are entirely wasted, right? If we were to make it that instead this is a currency item you can pull out of the window, which will clearly look valuable or be easy to look up, then very few of these will be wasted, because if you're not interested in that craft, rather than just storing it or whatever, I love chat. Anyway, if you can just pull it out, then this thing will be basically 100% useful because you can go and trade it for exalts. And so this increases the number of those crafts occurring in the economy. And remember, that is not the goal here, right? Our analysis is that it would be a roughly 10-to-1 ratio. So we strongly considered having these be tradable, but then they would occur 10 times less often. And what would happen would be that you would never see one, except as available on trade for people who are lucky. And we feel it is much better to be occurring more commonly, and players who are onto it and know what they're doing can see it more often and actually use it for themselves rather than being forced to trade it. And yes, you could ask the question, no, I want the same rates and to be tradable, but that's going to, again, cause the item problem we're trying very hard to not have.
But why specifically, like, so from what you just answered, it seemed like you were talking about specifically making the really valuable untradeable, right? Because you pointed out that like people would then know that they were valuable. But what if you just make it like really expensive, like either an orb or something that has to drop something? Maybe it's maybe you have the intention that only like big crafts are traded, so something worth at least 30 chaos or 60 or 100, whatever the number is, right? That's not important. But just make it so that any craft could be tradable, not necessarily just the augments. And, you know, if you're worried about letting people know that they're valuable.
The change to tradability would have to come with an appropriate change to rarity or a cost that's very high. And these sound good in practice until you hear the numbers, and then you would be unhappy with those. And so, yeah, I think, like, From a QOL point of view and stopping scamming, yeah, it's good. But it's not going to be what people want as a solution to this. Like, we would want it so that we can look in the logs and say how many of these crafts are done, and the number has not gone up as a result of this action. We want to improve the QOL and ease of life for this without having increased the amount of crafting that's happening as a side effect. And I'm pretty sure the steps we would have to take to achieve that would not be ones that people are happier with. And at the moment where you have a highest chance of getting it yourself, but you have to be paying some degree of attention and care, is probably a better place for it to be than to have it so the same number of crafts are occurring, but it's foolproof. And foolproof means a lot of fools are making money. Right now, you can profit from it if you're paying attention and are smart and know what the crafts do and make an effort to trade them to other people and so on.
So you're mostly happy with people using third-party platforms instead of having a way of trading them?
Because of these consequences, yeah. I mean, I don't want players to be scamming each other, right? Like, that's not good. But at the same time, right now, this is what we feel is the best way from a tradability point of view. This has been discussed relatively extensively, and it's unfortunately not as simple as just making it tradable.
I mean, if you made it tradable, it basically just turns all of the harvest crafts into new versions of currency orbs that don't exist in the game, right? Which seems a bit weird.
They are tradable right now, though.
But no, well, his point is it like currently it's hard or annoying, so it de-incentivizes you to do it, right? So I don't do it because I can't be bothered, and so do a whole bunch of other people. And if all of a sudden we did, you'd have to like lower the rates at which you'd see it, because it'd be far more common to have that happen, and thus you can make much better items unless they then shuffled everything down. So I'm with Chris. Roast me.
I'm not. I feel like this like very, very pushes it towards like... It's not that. Well, yeah, and actually this is looking a little bit up for the more casual player, because this is obviously very heavily incentivized towards more no-lifers and stuff like that, more than anything.
Shouldn't they be rewarded for no lifing?
Sure, but there's a happy middle ground where you aren't forced to use third-party stuff.
Yeah, and there are ways to achieve that. Like, for example, having secure trade of some kind of complicated system where you take someone to your harvest crafting bench and you have the ability to put up a complex trade screen where instead of like, here's my item, here's the currency that I'm paying you and so on, you do it in one action where it's done securely. That reduces scamming. It's also a real pain, and for the time being, we're not doing that. And this has come up in discussion. Like, for example, we're making some guild changes in 3.16, and one of the things we were looking at, which was eventually not done in 3.16 because it's hard, is the concept of having like shared mastercrafts among guild members who are online at the time, or even friends who are online at the time potentially, where you have the ability for like, you've got a mastercraft, I want to use it. Normally I give you my item, I give you the currency for the craft, and I give you like a tip for your time, and then you leave with all of them. And then customer support doesn't do anything about it. And I'm not blaming our customer support department, because there are a lot of false reports, I should add, about the scamming thing. That's why we have to establish a pattern. But long story short, the ability to do that kind of trade securely is something that would benefit the game. We aren't doing it at the moment because there's other things we want to work on, to be honest. That's a bit of a pain to implement. But that would help the harvest situation from the point of view of safety without necessarily increasing the danger very much.
Right. Next up, a lot of people in the community are asking if you guys have talked about, for example, a lot of people want to know if bringing Harvest back to full power would be okay at the cost of making items soulbound or non-tradable.
Okay, let's talk about soulbound stuff. So there are two problems with this approach. The first one is, once an item is soulbound, it can't be traded. And that means you've just got a thing that you cannot give away to someone else. So the value that you've put into getting it is gone, right? This is a big downgrade in your character's value, as it were, because normally in Path of Exile, you get items, you equip them, you use them, and then you have the ability to trade them for other stuff. You're not taking a net worth hit as an exchange for using things. It's relatively hard to find soulbound stuff in real life. I was thinking about this, right? If I buy the autopilot upgrade for my Tesla, that's $10,000 that's essentially soulbound, because then if I take my car and sell it to someone else, they turn that upgrade off, right? So that's licensed to me personally. It's like one of those codes you get with a game back in the day, which is only using, it's only enabled on your Xbox account. Then when you trade the game, they don't have that. And so I am not willing to spend this money on self-driving because of the fact that when I resell my car, that money was lost. It was entirely for my benefit. So there is an economic problem with soulbound items in action RPGs where your player takes quite a big step backwards wealth-wise at the point that they acquire it. The second problem here is that bringing Harvest up to full power as a compromise here is also the direction we don't want to go. We don't want people to get 10 out of 10 items so quickly, right? Like, as far as we're concerned, Harvest is the problem, not the solution to the itemization here. And so, while I appreciate the direction of inquiry, it's something that we don't think would help in this case. Sorry.
Sure. Yeah, no, just a lot of people wanted the answer to that. I'm not sure if I like the IRL analogy. Like, I don't know how much you go around throwing fireballs IRL either. So, um, but
Economies, you can learn from real life economies, right? Like, it's
yeah,
good to look at the experience that humans have had over thousands of years trading things between people, and we do look at economics and we do care about this stuff when we're designing Path of Exile's economy.
right. Next on the list, I think we're done with Harvest. You'll be happy to know. That's like the main things there that people were bringing up.
Oh, wait, I'll say one
Yeah.
actually. The still harvest
But
related,
wait,
of
there's
course.
more.
The current Oshabi spawn rate is horrible, right? I think. Like, I've played, since the revamp. I've done Ritual, Ultimatum, and now this league, and I've still yet to encounter this boss. And I've done every harvest and like all of that. I mean, that might just be a
feedback.
Yeah, that's just a small, piece of feedback or something. But that boss doesn't exist as far as I'm concerned right now.
They are re-evaluating Harvest, right? And that's going to mean looking at the Oshabi spawn rate. So yeah, it may be increased. I'm not philosophically opposed to that one. I know I've just said no for a long time, but yeah, that can be improved if people feel it needs to be.
Yeah.
There we go. We got a yes out of Chris in a harvest-related topic. You're welcome, community. I'm now your hero.
Wait, she doesn't let you craft, right?
Oh no.
I'm kidding.
Okay, next up. So Smart Loot. Smart Loot gets asked about a lot, and things like, for example, seeing a big reduction on like maybe the drop pool, so that there's more things, like less clutter. Obviously, you talked about being able to remove things from the filter, which is great. But yeah, rares in general is very unexciting right now. You very rarely drop upgrades. And have you thought about doing more drop-only mods like veiled items, incursion, or simply higher tiers that are drop-only?
So I try to avoid using the term smart loot because I really don't want to imply that the game is going to make decisions about what items are better for your character or for your build. Like, we're never going to look at what you're playing and then try to drop something that's for you. The goal is that we want to make sure that items that drop on the ground are compelling items. So we definitely want there to be fewer items that drop because there's obviously a lot of clicking, a lot of wasted time at the moment, which affects performance of both the client and the server and so on. And we want to make sure the items on the ground are better relative to crafted items. Now, there are two ways this can be done, right? In hard mode, it's easy because you just gut the crafting system out, so it's very special. And dropped items on the ground are still just as terrible as they currently are, and there's far fewer of them and all of that kind of stuff, right? Which is great. In the core game, however, we do not want to take a step backwards in terms of players' expectations there. And so this means that when we're dropping items on the ground, we have to do systems like what we were previously describing in the decluttering thing, where it generates better rares. They're not better in the context of your character, they're just better than regular rares in the game that you would normally get. Now, we're not ready to go into more detail on specific plans there because we're still working on it. And to some extent, the hard mode experiment is very instructive here. I know I bring it up a lot, but we are very interested to see because it helps us tune. Like, it's a permanent beta as far as I'm concerned, right? Mid-league changes all over the place. This is a big experiment. And it lets us tune the ratio between crafted and dropped items. And while we're not going to go to the core game and say, you're now hard mode, we can learn from how people interact with the, with crafting and with item drops based on what we do with the ratio in hard mode. And that will be really good.
Right.
So is hard mode more of a just currently like a learning tool for you guys to kind of relearn the game and like the basics and what's important, what's not? Or are you fully expecting a lot of people to jump in and want to play this thing as well?
I don't really mind how many people play it. I'll be playing it and I want some people to trade with, but that's about it.
So,
but seriously, I'd be happy just keeping it as an internal tool. It's just that a lot of people are writing in saying they want to try it, and there's no harm to deploy it. It's easy, it's just an alternate league flag. So there's no particular harm there. I'm not expecting the average Path of Exile player to necessarily jump in. it's a mode where you can't experience all the content because the content is too difficult. That appeals to some people massively. Like they hear that and think, I can't do the high content, I'm going to try. And that's a challenge. But for a lot of people, they want to see what the game has to offer. We've spent a lot of money making sure there's a lot of fights in the game, and they want to play them all, and they want to feel like a god the whole way through. In hard mode, you feel like very rewarded when you get even close to god mode, and so it's a different type of reward system, and I don't think it'll appeal to everyone. And we're not, like we don't have high expectations because it's going to be a slow burner. It's like SSF. We released SSF initially and had a very small uptake, like less than 1% of players or something like that, and it's gradually becoming a more popular way to play. This is the same kind of thing, and we want to cater to multiple groups. And while I am super, super excited about it, because it's like a free time hobby to tinker with this, it isn't the core thing that we wake up and go to work to do, right? Like we are working on mainline Path of Exile content and lots of it.
So
Are you worried it might like? Sorry, I'll just finish. Are you worried it might cause like more sort of elitism amongst people and say, "Oh, you're not even playing SSFHC hard mode"? What does your opinion matter or whatever?
I really like the idea of some guy linking some pretty damn average rare boots on Reddit or whatever and saying, look at what I found in hard mode. And the other hard mode players are like, give them to me. You got 3 resists and run walk. I need these today, right? Whereas normally it's complete trash and you wouldn't bother to list it on PoE.trade. And so elitism, in the case that it actually took a ton of effort, is okay. I know it's a negative thing. Like we fought it with the hardcore community in the past, where we'd have streamers who basically say you're a scrub if you don't play hardcore, and it would cause a lot of problems. And that was something we had to really put a lot of effort in. And we may find a similar elitism with this, but people know what hard mode is, right? Like they know it's for that kind of player, and they can just go and play the main game. Because I don't think we're going to face an elitism problem there that's large.
right. So I wasn't planning on bringing up hard mode a lot, but so regarding hard mode, this is something that is only going to be for the 0.1% of the 0.1%. So I think a lot of the player base are pretty worried when you keep saying that you're going to get lessons from it, because the people playing that and giving you feedback is not going to mirror the average player that plays your game. So what kind of that's I think what a lot of people are worried about.
It's being able to get feedback from a stripped down version of something helps you make assumptions, helps you make changes to core assumptions in the game. It lets you look at, like, right now, if I say what percentage of items are equipped that came from the ground without modification, the answer is going to be very low, close to 0. That's not the right amount. But what is the right amount? We can determine that with something like hard mode, where we can turn the knobs really easily because it's quite simple and it's one that we can just play with over time. We're not necessarily looking at opinions from the hard mode users. We understand the opinions are going to be make it harder, blah, 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 right? Like, that's cool, but that doesn't necessarily reflect the user who's chosen not to play hard mode. But we will be looking at data from users that are playing hard mode and our own anecdotal opinions as well.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And yeah, I get the understanding that it's like we announced the Xbox version of the game a few years ago, and there was a complete meltdown of the community because we'd spent resources on something that wasn't the version that they are playing. And it's the same kind of fear, right? This is something that's causing at least a minor distraction, but the goal here is to improve Path of Exile as a result, and probably create a lot of fun for the people who do want to play it.
Right. So on Baeclast, you talked about this a little bit. Like you and you talked about how, like, I think somewhere after Legion, maybe Synthesis was the first one, where leagues would start dropping like everything from everywhere. So you would start seeing a lot of like very, very other league mechanics, and you seem to agree that that was not a good solution. And you've started working on that a little bit with, like, you were buffing the drop rate on Metamorph, where they would drop more catalysts and stuff. But are you now just moving more and more towards, like, Delve being specifically the best place to get fossils and resonators, and maybe even more so, or even the only place, and same with like Metamorph? And are we going to see like a lot more of this going forward? Like, how are we? What's the current state of this?
Our intention is that each league is the best place to get the rewards from that league, but not the only place necessarily. So if you want to get fossils, you can get them from a variety of places, but the efficient, targetable place to get them is by going to Delve, and so on and so on. And this is because we want the content to have an identity. We want there to be a degree of target farming with regard to those particular rewards, because it is good for there to be a slight bias there. And we don't want it so that a player who feels that they hate the idea of doing Delve feels that they must do it, especially in, say, Solo Self-Found, in order to get the fossils. And so the ideal endpoint we get here is that you can get these fossils and scarabs and so on from other means, but the best way to do it is through the content that's associated with it. There are things like essences that we really need to fix up, right? Like, you're getting way more essences from just general essence chests and rewards than you actually do from essence encounters currently. And so there is certainly a long way to go here, but philosophically, to be clear, we're not going to restrict it so the stuff only comes from its target league, but we're going to try to make sure it's the most reliable place to get it from.
Right. Okay. Okay. A lot of people are asking for quality of life features like auto sort or an inventory deposit. Is that something you are looking into at all?
No, we're not. That's back to the philosophical stuff again, item weight and all of that, which I've ranted about a fair amount. But no, we don't want to do an auto sort or inventory deposit. So we can talk about these, right? So auto sort is where for your inventory or your stash, you can click a button and it moves the items around, potentially to group things and maybe make more space, right? Because it's annoying to have to move items around. So you press the button and it consolidates your stuff and you've got some space. So aside from the item weight argument of the fact that, we want these things to feel real and therefore you have to move them around and all of that, which is creating busy work for players, and I know exactly how they feel about that. We just crossed another thing off the bingo card, I'm sure. But aside from all of that, auto sort has problems where what type of space do you even want? Do you want a 2x4? Do you want single slots? It's hard to actually come up with an algorithm that does that well, and then we don't even necessarily want that in the first place. With regard to mass deposit, we're talking saving some clicks when you go and control click your stuff into the stash. As in, along the line of the affinity slippery slope, right? Previously, you have to go to the stash tab you want to put the thing in, control click it in, go to another stash tab, control click it in. We added affinities so you could just spam control click, and the users are like, cool, you've removed half the clicks, can you remove the rest? By making it so I press a button so everything is just instantly stashed. This is in the direction of the game becoming a spreadsheet, right? Like, if it's just a thing where you don't care about your inventory, you just walk, because they want auto-looting of items on the ground under certain circumstances, like currency and so on. So you just walk near the items, they get absorbed into your inventory, you go to town, it just smushes it into your stash. It may as well email you a spreadsheet of what you've got at that stage, right? Like, why do we need a game client? And we're just very resistant to going further down that slippery slope. In the case of something like affinities, that was a concession we'd make. It does help, but we're not going to go the whole way to the spreadsheet dream.
Right. Yeah. I think obviously like part of the why people are feeling this way as well is because of the insane amount of clicks in Path of Exile compared to any other game. Like
I
it's
love
a
the fact that chat is saying true for this one. I was expecting to look over there and see no fun allowed, but yeah. Sorry
yeah.
for interrupting.
No, it's okay. It's just like it's a very large amount of clicks. I don't know if you saw the Ziggy was experimenting with like tracking the amount of clicks he did from Path of Exile, and it was a lot of clicks.
Yeah, I'm aware. Like, we've been talking about solutions, and the work we're doing on on stacking of currency and so on is going to help quite a bit.
Right. Okay, so you brought up affinity systems as well. Are there any updates coming to the affinity system to make it more customizable?
No, but that's not because philosophically we don't want to. It's just that I don't know of any problems it has, right? Like, if you have feedback about how the affinity system could be improved or how we can make it better, we'll consider it. So please, let me know now if you've got any. Otherwise, start the Reddit thread and
Right.
get some feedback.
So
We don't want to make it too easy, but it can be improved.
So just off the top of my head, right, you could have either a customizable one that you just have a lot more room, but even adding things like gems, for example, right? A lot of people would want that.
So far, we've made affinities for stash tabs that we sell. The idea being if we sell a tab, there's an affinity for it, and we also enable that affinity on free tabs as well. Like, to be clear, if we release a gem tab, you don't have to buy it for gem affinities to be a thing where you can put them in one of your stashes. Now, we are careful to not add affinities for literally everything, because we do want it so people have to choose, where their stuff goes to some extent. But if there's demand for things like gem tabs and so on, that creates an affinity at the same time. It's not one that we'd really put a lot of effort into.
Sure, but I don't necessarily know if people just want more tabs. Like, I'm sure there would people that would be buy that too, but then you're also gonna have the people complaining about more tabs and blah blah feeling forced to buy things. But is there ever going to exist affinities for things that don't have tabs?
So the goal here is to make it so that there's less changing between tabs, right?
Well, it's just like I don't understand why they're they're like just adding more value to quad tabs, for example, seems like a good thing as well, or just tabs in general.
Well, I can imagine the degree of customization could get pretty complex when you're like, okay, well, I want ID'd rare items to go in here, except when they're items that go in my chaos recipe stuff, and then they go over here, and like to actually read your mind will be a bit tricky for the rules. So that's why we've kind of gone broadly. Like clearly this is currency, it goes on the currency tab. Clearly that's a map, it goes over there. Clearly this is a div card, like
Sure,
quite broad categories.
sure, but we have, for example,
Yeah.
like prophecy and gem tabs would be easy things that don't even necessarily need their own tab, but would be really good to
Yeah.
have as part of the affinity.
To be completely honest, do not expect prophecy to remain part of the game for long. Like, let's rule that tab out. Um,
All right.
Whoops, I shouldn't have said that. Gem tab we can do.
Goodbye, purple lady. All right.
Is there ever a sort of a plan to maybe give a free tab to people, like that you can work towards, for example? Like, you complete Act 10 or something, you get a tab, or specifically even a premium tab, one that you can start selling stuff off, because that's a very powerful tool. So maybe gate it behind, playing enough of the game.
This is a tricky one because I definitely see the argument that A, it could cause people to buy more tabs or be a gateway to tabs, right? Secondly, it does help for players who are playing free and want more capacity, right? Like I'm sympathetic towards a user who has the 4 base tabs and is gradually finding them more full as we spam the game full of stuff. The tricky part is that selling tabs, especially the first tab you get, is kind of our core monetization. Like a lot of users will wisely, I say wisely because they're being careful with their money, just buy a small amount of currency, currency maybe a map tab, and then spend nothing else on the game because they have limited resources, but they feel that those are important purchases. And to some extent, if we gave them a third of that value for free, it might cut out a third of the value that we receive from a lot of our incremental users. And the bulk of users who just make up the people that spend $20 on tabs and that's their lifetime spend, that does contribute a lot to our bottom line. And so this is one thing that's good in theory, but it could also have a negative impact. And I want to make sure we've assessed that before we accidentally jump into it, because I really, really don't want to accidentally hurt our revenue. That's like number one thing I shouldn't be doing.
Right. What about a compromise like a limited, like say half a currency tab and half a premium tab that you can then upgrade later?
I'm open to this, right? Like maybe the solution is that we do a trial of some type and we clearly indicate that this is a temporary promotion and see how it goes with a group of players for maybe one league and see what the results are. And if we can get data to say that overall it helped spending and stuff, then that's great. And then if it has a negative effect, we just have to undo it and bear the rage.
Right. That makes sense. And as far as like the premium subs and stuff, have you guys considered about just removing the like non-premium tab entirely now that there's like, it's kind of, most people aren't going to use things like procurement or acquisition or post on the forums. Like people obviously want to use like the pathofexile.com/trade.
It's tricky because people have paid for premium tabs because they're better than regular tabs. And so if we were to then go and remove the regular ones or change this too much, while, I'm not saying it's lawsuit material, it's certainly feel bad material, and making people that have chosen to spend money feel bad is a problem. Like we have to be really careful changing anything related to stuff people have spent money on, because it's remarkable how a small change can cause people to feel very bitter about something like that. So we'd rather have the tabs be just incremental improvements. Like we added affinities as a free thing rather than making people pay to get an additional upgrade, because we kind of feel that nominally they've chosen to pay that extra buck for a premium tab compared to the regular ones. They've chosen that they want those tabs to, be nameable and colorable and have, special features, and that's why affinities were put in there rather than just being a new type of tab.
Well,
Was that a discussion that was had, making affinities like a viable thing to begin with?
Well, I mean, there's always discussion of making the tab system more complicated, so you can individually pay a little bit of extra money for each tab, like a point here and there, and so on. But there's enough implementation problems standing in the way of that it never gets very far. And there's the nice thing about generously saying this is a feature that's available for free, like stash tab folders, for example. They've been really useful, and we briefly discussed should we be selling these, and the answer of no, let's just give them to people. They already spend enough money on the tabs that lets them organize them better and feel good about it. We probably could have sold the folders for 50 cents each and it would have been acceptable, but we think this was the better plan overall.
So what about a compromise and I know I'm like asking a lot about this, but like trading is such a core feature of the game. What about letting the normal tabs at least trade? Like, sure, keep the like coloring scheme and keep the naming scheme, but like at least let everybody have one trading tab. Is such a core feature of the game.
I'm not opposed to this, though it does touch the two things we discussed before. One of them being, if we screw around with this, someone could say, I spent money buying that in order to trade, and now it's available for free for everyone. And while, I repeat, I don't think that that's actually like a legal problem, I do think we have to be careful about how people perceive it. And secondly, no, second thing's gone. Yeah, sorry, getting too old.
Sorry.
A good enough answer, and yeah, I think it's fine.
Yeah, I'm open to it though, right? Like, I'm not saying no to that. It's something that we probably should experiment with.
Yeah.
There's also questions of shill accounts as well, where a person could register 1,000 accounts to be able to list stuff on trade for free. That is a thing. Currently, you have to spend money before you're able to get things into the trade system, and so that helps prevent abuse when it's tied to an account with purchases on it.
Sure. I get that. That is a lot of effort though. If that person's gonna make like 1,000 accounts or 100 accounts, they probably don't have the like biggest intention of spending money on the game to begin with.
Oh, right. But what if they were a large syndicate of item farmers with massive automation and, like
Right. Right.
it is concerning because right now the large syndicates of item
But
farmers can't easily.
do we not
They
have bots already? You know?
I don't want to make it worse, and we're
Right.
working very hard. Like, our bot situation is rather good at the moment, right? Like, people use the word solved, and I say to them, it is not solved, and get all angry. But, that's just me with my strong opinions about that.
Right.
Right now, the payment thing is an issue, right? Like, if a bot network needs to get currency tabs and so on, which they want to do for efficiency and various internal reasons, they have to spend money on this, and then we can attack them from a payments point of view. We can see what cards they're using, and we can unfortunately often stolen credit cards, which is kind of sad, but either way, it's an angle, right? But that they can be all anonymous behind proxies if there's no need to put any actual real money into our account.
Right. That makes sense.
Or cynically, we want the bots to pay us. That's a really good argument the chat should be making. I'm kidding though.
That you eventually ban and then encourage them to repay you again, right?
Unfortunately, because of the chargebacks, we lose like $10 for each time one of the poor victims who had his credit card used. So what we'll often do is refund the purchases when we realize it's credit card fraud, we'll ban the account, refund the purchases so that we avoid the chargeback fee and the poor guy in middle America doesn't lose his $10.
Right. Okay. Next thing that people are curious about was the tier 4 Ashley nerf. Was that too hard? It wasn't a guaranteed way to finish items already, because obviously sometimes you could just get something that wasn't relevant for your item. Having the forced annulment seems too much. Maybe if you felt it was too powerful or too guaranteed, what about diluting the pool more instead of the annulment? And obviously killing Katarina is already considered a pretty bad downside because she resets all the relationships and the syndicate board.
So we felt this was just too powerful. It's basically an exalt that, rather than acting like a normal exalt, guarantees some form of high tier mod. You're right that you can miss occasionally, but it still basically only gives really good mods. Having a guarantee of a minimum amount of power is not something we want to have our crafting system enable, and that's why there's the annulments. You're taking a risk with it. It's worth noting people still finish their items off with mastercrafts, even though those are generally a lot weaker than these high tier veiled mods. In terms of the math of whether you should kill Katarina or not, Ashling isn't the only reason to kill Katarina, of course. There are a lot of other good rewards available. A lot of people feel that the rewards of the kill are more valuable than the loss of relationships, including people on our dev team. And yeah, we're keeping a close eye on this one, but we just felt it was too powerful before, again, creating the atomization problem that we're trying very hard to keep an eye on.
I could have imagined a lot of people thought it was almost a slap in the face to the, people that want the deterministic crafting, where you're like, oh, okay, here's still a little bit of deterministic crafting left in the game. It's too good, now we'll take it away, or we'll still let you have it, but gambling, which is what everyone's, main problem with the PoE crafting system apparently is these days, which is something was only brought up ever since like Harvest came into play, I feel. So it's just,
Once you show someone there's a lever, they want you to pull the lever, if you see what I mean. You can create a purely gambling system and it's acceptable for enough years until you accidentally experiment with something that's more deterministic, and then that's how the game has to be. Sorry that that sounds a bit cynical, but yeah, we're a little frustrated by that. But it is completely
Yeah.
understandable response to it.
Did you find that interesting as well? Because like prior to the whole harvest system, you know, the craft system basically fine, right? It's gambling. You get, you know, sometimes rewarded. It feels good. You don't, and obviously it feels bad. But there's something to chase. And then all of a sudden, this system comes out, and everyone's like, "Well, the rest of the game is just gambling, and that's shit, and it's always been shit." Did that feel like just kind of interesting to learn?
Yeah, it's the lessons from this are experiment less, to be honest, right? Like, you know, if I had a clean slate and a new community that didn't have expectations, I think the solution of like make sure you're presenting people with stuff that you know is the right direction for the game rather than occasionally go in the wrong direction and go, how about this? Because to some extent, if you go in the wrong direction and they say, I hate it, you're like, okay, I've got it. We understand. We do that. We're good at that one. But when you go in the wrong direction and they say, I love it, make it this now, and you think, oh, what have I done? That's the problem.
So I don't necessarily think everybody absolutely loved crafting before Harvest came in. I think they maybe tolerated it. Like obviously there's always people that have wanted more deterministic crafting. Look how popular multi-mod was. But there was nothing else. And I think was it a Magic the Gathering dev quote where or maybe it was a quote from you, but like your audience is good at identifying the problem, not always necessarily on making suggestions on how to fix it. And for a lot of people, a lot of the things that they didn't enjoy got fixed by Harvest, right? That's why there was such a big surge because now maybe people didn't like know what they wanted, but maybe for a lot of people what they wanted was Harvest. So that's why there was such a big like changeover.
Yeah, and we understand that deterministic crafting has a role in the game, right? Like we could go, if you want to see a game without deterministic crafting, try hard mode. So in the core game, though, we understand it has its place, and we're working on finding the right place for it.
Right.
Do you think part of the solution would be just to make current crafting in PoE more like streamlined, as in like less confusing? Because a lot of
That's a good
people
idea.
just don't have any idea what to do when they first get into it, into the end game, whatever. And there's not even very good information out there from, you know, the user base, our streamers and everything, because it's so goddamn hard to put up any sort of crafting guides that become outdated league to league since everything changes all the time. So
Okay.
just more like in-game friendliness for it.
I kind of imagine something like an advanced item view, which lets you like easily. I know we have an advanced item view, but I imagine something that's kind of interactable, where you can click on a mod to see what else is in the family and what else rolls at a certain level, and you can change the level brackets and see what mods are possible. And like, you know, it's a bunch of work for sure, but there's almost the ability to have kind of an item workshop kind of thing when you're crafting, so you can really clearly understand what's possible with each action you're about to do.
Mm-hmm.
Would be pretty cool. Unfortunately, a lot of work, but yeah.
Yeah.
With the influx of new players for PoE 2 especially, it could be something that's worth having in place by then.
Something
Ah, the crafting tab. That's a good idea from chat. Gate it behind money. I'm just kidding.
I just thought of something related to the harvest thing earlier that I just spaced out and thought about, which was with the fighting things like blister lords and stuff, because there are quite a lot of hard enemies. Which you've not done this with tier 4s. Like if you're fighting a tier 4 beast, you get that. But there are like quite a lot of the tier 3s that are quite hard as well. Maybe not having like the player fight them entirely, because that feels very bad for a lot of people right now. Like seeing those monsters that are maybe hard to craft, having to defeat them and not getting anything.
Right. So even though you get told beforehand, you don't like the fact that you then have to fight a monster that you are not getting a craft for.
Yes. That feels very bad.
Okay, I'll pass that feedback onto the team. I mean, there are ways to there are ways to solve that for sure.
Yeah. Right. Okay. So we're moving on to like the Atlas and the in-game. I'm slightly worried that you answered this when I spaced out. I'm gonna ask it instead
Yes.
just to make sure.
That exact question
The
has
harvest thing we did, yeah.
Yes.
I
Okay, that's
basically
what I
brought
thought.
that
That's
up.
what I thought I heard, but I spaced out a little bit and I
Yep.
was like, did he say that? Right. Okay, sweet. That's already been answered. Next up, why can we not farm conquerors at lower tiers?
So I had to go to some team members for this. I'm like, what even is this question? What are they asking for? And they kind of reflected it back to me with the question of why do we want to do this, right? Why would you want to fight a lower tier conqueror? Is it for practice? For awakened gems? Is it because you want to get their high-level rewards with less risk? Like, what's the goal here of farming
Well,
lower tier?
I would think it's because whenever you make a new character, you've done a bunch of progression in your previous one, you've beaten everything, it's done like, let's say Awakener 8. You make a new character and it's like level 75 or something and it's gone through a few tiers of maps. It can't realistically have fun or stand a chance against the max tier conquerors until, another 10, 15 levels or a bunch of gear progression. And thus you're just like grinding through and slogging low tiers until mid tiers and like just getting no additional fun in. Whereas before, you're like occasionally looking forward to a boss fight, especially when it was early Conquerors. Every 3 like influences, you just have to do 3 maps in that zone. Conqueror fight, 3 maps,
Yeah.
Conqueror fight, and then all of a sudden it's like tier 14 to 16. It might be 9 of that type of zone, that map, and your like fresh character just is either thrown in the deep end or it doesn't have as much fun as the previous ones.
Okay, I'll pass that feedback on to the team. It's a good answer.
Yeah. So it actually ties into the next question, which is right now the game is very top or end game heavy, where everything really worth doing is at the end. Whereas earlier in Path of Exile history, there were other exciting things to do, like farming low tier maps very fast, right? That was very, very popular, where you would deck out a character in high magic find gear and you maybe couldn't farm tier 16s or high level maps, but you would be very, very quickly at farming like maybe tier 4 maps and stuff like that. But everything right now in the game, or a large percentage, is gated behind Atlas passives, Maven Watchstones, and high tier maps. And that makes like a lot of the earlier parts of the game feel unrewarding and just like a chore that players have to get to the exciting part. That's sort of the problem for a lot of people with campaign too, right? It's just something they have to push through to get to the enjoyable bit of the game.
This prompted quite an interesting philosophical discussion with the team about this, where I began to realize that the way the endgame is currently set up is actually a bit contrary to the way I'd philosophically believe it should be. But without repeating that whole rant here, I think it's easy to emphasize that we're shortening this grind in 316 and we're completely redesigning it in 317, right? Like, yes, we hear you, right?
Sure.
Not going to argue with this one. I should note that we implicitly do want to give the best rewards for the highest content. Like, you're going to want to try to get to the end of the atlas, do all the hard things and so on to get the best items. That's always going to be a goal here. The pacing of it is a bit interesting, though. And that leads on to my large rant, but we can probably skip that one.
Sure. Like the important bit here is that there is things that is fun in tier 1 maps, tier 5 maps, just different, right? And the economy is going to balance itself around that. And I agree, definitely, like the most endgame content should be the most worth. And also, I think a lot of people really want to hear your rant, but
Yeah, go on, lay it on us.
you have a few days, right? So we have plenty of time.
It basically keys into the fact that, like, again, imagine experience progression. In original PoE, right? The goal with experience progression was getting to level 90 is an achievement. If you're in the 90s, you're showing that you're a character who knows what they're doing. This is back when the game was a lot slower, right? And then the intention is each level takes exponentially longer to get to and gives you just 1 passive skill as a reward. We were not doing a thing where you get to level 95 and get 10 passive skills, and there's this kind of gating where you have to get to that to get your player power. To some extent, the difference between level 95 and level 100 is 5 passives, which by the time you've got like 115 of them or something, is completely irrelevant for the most part. Like, your last 5 passives are not doing very much for you because you've already got all the important things on the tree, so the marginal cost is low. And so obviously, nowadays it's faster to level up. Certain alternate game modes might not be. But the problem is that when we've been designing our endgame rewards, we've often gone and put quite a lot of power at certain gated points very high in the progression. Like, for example, the Uber Lab is an example of something where you get a really impactful boost to your ascendancies randomly somewhere in the middle of the endgame. And while we wanted that initially to be a Star Wars Galaxies style Jedi unlock grind that's incredibly difficult, that takes you months or years to do, blah, 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 the problem is that you're gating a ton of power there. And if that was a thing, if we'd pitched it so there was this incredibly long grind to unlock like 2% more power, that's probably a better place than 20% more power. Because a 2% power unlock, you don't really have to have. It's a nice thing you can work towards that you feel like you definitely need, but it's not actually mandatory. And so we've taken mandatory things and stuck them right at the end game, when the correct thing to do is to have the mandatory things earlier and have the relative size of the rewards get smaller, because that's the point where you're min-maxing and fine-tuning. And I think that the Atlas passive stuff and the whole design of the Atlas at the moment takes these big rewards and jams them right in the place where we should be getting diminishing returns to have the rewards be the right size.
Mhm.
And this is something I only realized drawing graphs of it recently, comparing the progression of power in good old Diablo 2 and good old original Path of Exile. With current Path of Exile, there are these giant spikes, and players think, I need that giant spike. Physically, to kill monsters, I need it. And therefore, I have to jump through all these hoops. And if we had it so the giant spikes were front-loaded, so you're getting most of your progression early in that endgame and having smaller incremental benefits, I personally think that would be a better system. Now, this is something that I rant about philosophically, that we're still trying to work out what we're even doing with the endgame. But anyway, that's the rant.
Right.
Good run.
Good run.
And Chad agrees. I rolled well. Okay, good.
You rolled well. And obviously, like, another thing as well with making the earlier game more exciting, a lot of people really like being able to run the same map over and over again. Now, for a while in Path of Exile, we could shape our own maps and run exactly the map. If you really liked Strand, you could run Strand over and over and over again, right? And now that brings us to the favored map system. But for a lot of people, the favored map system unlocks kind of late. Even the first slot unlocks kind of late. Have you guys discussed changing when that unlocks? Because right now, because it unlocks so late, it incredibly rewards players with the knowledge of not completing maps. I can't remember what league it was, but sometime recently where I made a video about, ooh, if you don't complete these maps, you're getting all the residences you don't need. And then I had a lot of people saying, well, what if I've already completed those maps? Well, then you're screwed, right? It's obviously less extreme, but it's sort of similar to if you couldn't regret something, a skill point, right? If you made a permanent choice when you don't have the knowledge, that even when you do have the knowledge, you can't fix it later. Which honestly, I think if favored maps unlocked earlier, it's kind of in a good spot. Like I kind of see a lot of good in it. But there is obviously a lot of people that want to go back to being able to very specifically target farm maps.
Okay, I'll pass the feedback on to the team. We still have to do a whole design for 317 anyway, so it's definitely not too late to consider that.
Right. Awesome.
You did tie in that question about campaign. Was that going to come up another time, or is that something we should have addressed right here and there?
Probably should have talked more about the campaign too. With obviously,
because I can jump into that one.
Yeah,
just
do that.
A bit.
Do that.
So yeah, a lot of people still really don't like just chain running the campaign as leveling new characters, and you do say that it's going to be more fixed in PoE 2, but more just by proxy of having a better campaign system. Like you'll run through it and you'll enjoy it more. But there's still going to be a huge subset of people that just don't want to run the same campaign over and over again. And part of the current content bloat of the game is there's a whole bunch of stuff you need to set up that you can't do until later, but you get access to earlier. So if you're running through and you pick up delve stuff and heist stuff, and you can't, really stop your campaign and go do that stuff, because then you'd be way out of whack with your progression. Is there ever any sort of potential discussion about not having to strictly do the campaign? Or you can still do the campaign, but while you're doing those other things, you're progressing your levels, and then you can come back slightly further into the campaign, if you know what I mean.
It's relatively close to a philosophical no, but it's something we have actually had conversations about. I'll, sigh and then raise it with the team, and people will sigh and we'll talk, and no one's particularly happy, but there are discussions happening there. We honestly keep coming back to problems with the campaign and problems with the pacing of content that we feel could be fixed.
Sorry.
Sorry, you were going to say this?
No, I don't want to interrupt you. Keep going. Sorry.
One of the reasons why the PoE 2 campaign is a lot better is because the variety in areas really does give a lot more replayability. And that's quite important. Especially Acts 6 through 10 just have a bit less topological variety than they should do in terms of the random layouts. And so it becomes a bit more of a chore to get through. I can't emphasize enough how we're designing the PoE 2 campaign to actually be replayable and interesting. We made mistakes with the PoE 1 campaign, and the addition of alternate content and stuff there does give a reprieve in terms of interesting stuff to do, because you can go on incursions every now and then and that kind of thing, but it doesn't fix its core problems, which is something we're excited about with PoE 2. One thing to bear in mind is a lot of people say, okay, cool, so when we've got to maps, we've got a first character through the campaign, they're fine playing that every league, but they don't want to play it multiple times per league for their subsequent characters. They want, for example, the ability to use Endless Delve to level a second character. Sounds like a brilliant idea, because Endless Delve is exciting and so on, but it will get boring much faster than the campaign will. It has far less variety. Like right now it's a treat, because we roll it out every now and then as a special event and so on, and it's kind of unsolved and people don't know what to do, whereas with the campaign you strictly know what path to run through. But it implicitly has less content and less going on and far less work put into it. And so we believe that if it was an alternate leveling mechanism, it would be far worse than the campaign. Having said that, there's discussions ongoing, right? Like we hear the feedback, we understand that's what the players are interested in, and we're at least talking about it.
So
I pretty much agree with that. Like, just the endless delve thing. Like, I do think that if you had something like endless delve, endless sledge, it gets boring pretty quickly. But what I'm saying is more like you can still choose to do a bit of like your delve progression at level 40, and then you come back at level 45, and you still be a little bit further progressed along in the campaign. So you didn't just
Like,
waste your time doing that.
what does it do with your quest items and stuff? Like, there's 100 questions there. Like,
Well, yeah, that's a problem for you guys to solve there, but I think it's something that
right.
would actually be worth like looking into because it doesn't matter how good you're going to make this new campaign in PoE 2. There's still going to be a lot of people that quit after 2 or 3 weeks because they really don't want to level another character through the campaign. After like 2 or 3 characters, they go, okay, I've gone through the campaign a few times. I would like to try more builds, but I just can't be bothered doing that. Whereas if you're like doing those little alternate scenarios where you can start working on your heist, start working on your delve or your incursions, and then come back and
how do we
see what I
feel
mean?
about Diablo 2? What do we think about Diablo 2, guys, which is entirely campaign and the end game is running static-ish areas again? Is that cool these days? I like it. I understand
My
that maps
feeling
are
is it's a 20-year-old dead game, but
Yes. I
you
think
know.
that's most people. I feel it's very, very outdated. We're gonna have people like you and me that love that type of game, but it's the same reason that I don't think Diablo 2 Resurrected is going to have a very long shelf life without mods, because you're gonna get boomer gamers like us that are gonna absolutely love it, but it doesn't hold up to modern ARPG standards.
Did you
well,
give
we're
Resurrected a shot, Chris?
I have played it and I'm looking forward to playing it. Unfortunately, there were not good servers anywhere near close to New Zealand, and so I was given flashbacks of our sync work we had to do in mid 2014, to be honest. Jonathan and I sitting there at weekends, alternately crying, trying to work how to fix desync. Like, there's math that will do this. They didn't work it out for D2, we're going to get this sorted. And we did. And then I'm given massive flashbacks to those days while playing D2 on a laggy server. And so I really hope they have servers closer than the east coast of America for people in New Zealand. Otherwise, I cannot play that game at release, but I am
So
looking forward to it. But that's a bit of a rant
yeah,
anyway.
I actually have something kind of important here because the thing you're saying that people would be bored of Delve as well, that is completely right, but that's not the problem. The problem is that people don't give a shit about how they're getting their character to 70 because they're not enjoying that progression at all. So it's not the fact that people would maybe agree with you that yeah, they would be getting bored of the Delve pretty quickly too, but that's also the thing about PoE 2. They're going to get bored of that very quickly too because there's no important sense of progression going through any of those. Especially, and this is something I very recently learned because I've specifically been trying to talk to people, and I don't have this problem because I play hardcore. We do have a sense of progression on hardcore, but on softcore they don't. They can run into bosses 100 times, 1,000 times during the campaign, and it doesn't matter. You're not incentivized to level up your items or gear appropriately while leveling. It's just a chore that you have to get through for most people, where they get to the interesting, fun part of the game.
I wonder if gamers are actually getting bored more quickly as a change that's happened society-wise. Like, is this a thing with like Netflix and YouTube have brought on like a global attention deficit issue, or like is it expectations from other games? Because we used to play
Sure.
these kind of games and actually have a great time playing through this content, if you know what I mean. Like, is it that we are different, or just that our
I
like is it the
I
nature of the
I think it is that we're different. We grew up on very different games. Like when I talk about the fact that like, oh yeah, Mephisto for 16,000 hours, that's amazing. There's very few people agreeing with me. It is a very
I
difference in
gave
ideology.
I gave that a bit of a thought some time ago as well, and I think it's just, our entire environment, our world is different because you have so many different outlets for like social interaction potentially. Like even just watching a stream for a while in the privacy of your own home feels like you've socially interacted, right? Even though you've done nothing. Whereas back then, you're playing your Diablo 2. You didn't care about the trade system, being tedious and shit. You didn't care about the like plenty of tedium stuff because you were actually engaging with people there, and that was your social, like interaction, and you're happy to do it. And you played those games much more for the social interactions as well. You'd pick up friends in those games, and you'd talk to them regularly, and you'd look forward to playing with them. And it's not really a thing as much anymore now because I think you can get a lot of your perceived social interaction from your Instagrams, your Twitters, and your Twitches. And so it's not as important of an aspect. Same with World of Warcraft. Like World of Warcraft Classic was a very social game where you went in and you didn't mind it was slow and you played around with lots of people and you talked to lots of people, you made friends. And then slowly over time, it just became a get in, get out, do your thing, and don't really care about other people. And you can see it if you go back to World of Warcraft Classic now. It doesn't really hold up. It doesn't feel as good. It doesn't have that same adventure and that same social experience. So I think yeah, the entire thing is just completely different, and we react to games differently because of that.
We also have more
So the
technology now.
conclusion is it's the children who are wrong. Sorry.
Well,
I mean,
okay. So the thing about that, right?
first of all,
It's
they are, but yes.
but we have more technology now. Like I said, right? Well, it's like now that people have seen better, a lot of people want better. Back 20, 21 years ago, you didn't have that many options. You didn't have that many things to do. You couldn't really expect Blizzard North back then to shit out new content every 6 months. Like you guys put out content at a insane rate, right? Like it was just very different back then. Can't expect the same things.
Yeah. Well, it's a really interesting discussion. And we'll bear it in mind with decisions around the campaign and stuff like that. I mean, we've had nuts ideas for leagues in the past. Like we had this one where you find itemized characters. It's like a doll or something like that of a marauder, and you can roll mods on it. So you chaos it until it's got like specific keystones, and then when you expand that, it turns into a character on your account with like pre-allocated passive. I mean, this is crazy and silly, but we come up with some nuts ideas for stuff that we can't do.
Right.
Well, that was part of the whole suggestion for the campaign thing. You brought up D2, but like D2 and a lot of these ARPGs had this very classic system of normal, nightmare, hell, right? And you had to go through it 3 times, and then it felt like you just threw that entire system out and made this, Act 1 to 10, and it was a big game changer. And look at the possibilities, but it's a very different and scary thing, right? I think this could be a similar sort of thing where you don't necessarily have to just progress through the usual campaign, but you can do the little side stuff to also progress it at the same time, and it could be a big game changer.
You are right. The discussion we were having internally is we realized we were about to get a lot of new players because Act 5 was good and 300 was going to do well and our numbers were trending up hard. And we came to the conclusion that we couldn't release with 3 acts of, 3 difficulties worth of content. Like the repeat of you have to play through the campaign 3 times to get to the end game would have been crazy, right? So we've reduced that to just once or twice, depending on how you look at it with regard to part 2 being similar to part 1 and feeling. So yeah, we have in the past acknowledged the fact that we do have to make sure that the campaign is interesting. At the moment, at least, it's unique areas you're running through each time. It's not actually a repeat, but yeah, I get it. People have been doing it for a decade. There's parts of it that I find boring as well, but I do want to try to make those parts more interesting before we completely scrap it.
So obviously a lot of people, like you guys don't seem to be super willing to compromise and give people adventure mode or whatever, right? So something that a lot of people find appreciative because they want adventure mode, you don't. But what about things like there are items like 7 League Step? There used to be gloves, like fossil gloves, that would give the power like a lot of power. It would be basically 70 or 80 flat damage. So then you could at least quickly level through the campaign, and this was gated behind endgame items, right? Like fossils. You used to be able to use essences, endgame essences, like Hysteria, for example, on boots, and that would be a really, really fun, enjoyable leveling experience. Like endgame stuff that you can use on new characters that, yeah, you might not have access to the first 3 days, the first week, but for those people that already does feel like it is a chore, that seems like a good compromise.
We like the idea of there being items you can put in your stash and then put on new characters, right? Twinking items or leveling items or whatever term you want to use. They're
Sure.
important, right? Like to some extent, one of the joys of playing hardcore is that you fill a stash full of stuff because you know you're going to die, and this makes your second character faster. And of course, the same thing, happens in standard as well, where you're going to have to play another character. You want the experience to be quick, and having it so your first time through the campaign is relatively slower, and then your subsequent ones are faster, is definitely a thing we want to encourage. Even in SSF, you have the ability to stash items for your future characters on your account, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the thing we do want. Things like the ability to make completely broken boots using high-end essences and so on, while I don't recall that particular change myself, because it was probably done without me being aware of it, those kind of fixes are done when something is really quite abusive. So we do want this. We do want it to be fun. We probably don't want it to be abusive. And so we have a lot of leveling uniques. It doesn't take that many chaos to equip a character that can level through the game 2 or 3 times faster than a base character would do. I've done it myself enough times.
Sure.
So we like that experience, but there will probably be curbing of the most egregious abuse cases.
Yeah, it's just I don't know. For me in my head, I'm like, how much abuse can there really be throughout the leveling process, right?
Fair enough. Look, I mean, I'd have to go and check into the
Yeah.
exact cases of what changed there. In principle, I'm okay with this kind of thing. It isn't a no fun allowed. You can have some fun here. It's been granted by the dictators briefly.
Excellent. Next up, we have, will there ever be more standalone endgames aside from maps, or will everything revolve around maps as the core mechanic? You talked a lot about there's a big revamp coming in 3.17, loads of endgame stuff, but are we ever going to see, for example, Delve being a standalone endgame, or like 4 or 5 different ones, like, oh, okay, I don't really want to do mapping this league. I want to go to the Beyond world or the Harbinger world and explore that endgame.
So we've added alternate endgames in the past, Delve, Reddit, that kind of thing. We philosophically feel that they should be tied to maps. The access to getting to Delve involves running maps as your core thing, and trade is what comes in to ease this slightly. It is possible at the moment. We see people doing it where they want to run perma logbooks, they want to run perma heist, they want to run perma Delve, and they do that by essentially just trading everything they get for access to that content. They either get good stuff from that content that they can trade for more of it, or the amount of mapping that they've done has set them up for the cycle. And we like that. But it basically is a privilege, I use that term carefully, of trade players, where if you're playing in SSF, you probably cannot permanently lock in some type of content. We want it to be a thing that you explicitly have to sacrifice a lot of value in order to get.
But you have explicitly said that if you are playing SSF, that is a disadvantage you are imposing on yourself. And speaking as an SSF player, I'm sorry, but I don't feel like SSF players should matter for the balance of the game. That is a small subset of players. We are taking that disadvantage on ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, I'm an SSF player as well. I just don't expect to be able to do perma delve. I just do a lot of delve if I want to delve. Trade helps with that. We'll look at adding more endgames in the future, right? Ideally, Delve is a great league, right? Like, it's an awesome endgame there. Heist has made a contribution to Path of Exile's endgame, giving you cool stuff to do. These are all, even the ability to like trade for a bunch of itemized Temple of Atzoatls, for example. These are all things we really like. The ability to trade for endgame content and to create endgame content and itemize it and save it for later. There will be more of this. It's just that it's probably all going to be centered around the map system.
So you don't think you will ever experiment with like something being completely decentralized and having its own endgame?
We've just established that the campaign becomes boring because people want maps. Maps are interesting. Why are maps interesting? Because there are literally hundreds of tile sets and thousands of monsters and massive variety randomly thrown at you, right? We've established that Delve would probably be boring as a leveling thing, so it would probably be boring as a dedicated endgame. Maps is the thing with the content and the budget and the interest and the randomness and the layers, so it's important that that's kind of the core of it. If we can luck into an endgame that's as exciting as maps that we just randomly come up with in an expansion, that's amazing, and we'll try. But we expect to have the stuff be accessible branching off maps.
But I think that kind of balances itself out, no?
Okay, chat's telling me maps are bad as well. Okay, so it's all bad.
No, I mean, clearly there's a lot of passion, right? Obviously, a lot of people enjoy the game.
Just says synthesis, which clearly solves all the problems, right? Like, just turn that back on and we're done.
So synthesis would have been something that would have worked as a standalone endgame, right? The same with Delve Heist probably would have worked as a standalone endgame as well. So I'm very surprised that you've not experimented with at least one league having a completely standalone endgame. Seems to be a lot there could be to learn from that.
Potentially. I mean, we've got our redesign of the endgame stuff happening, so
Yeah.
this will certainly be discussed.
Yeah, I'm very excited for that.
Clearly, the
I
answer
think-
is simple.
I think the current Reddit endgame is actually pretty shit. So if you could do something about that, you know, go there once a week, tell them how cute they are, something like that. I think it'd really spice up that endgame.
They dropped some new rules on the new Reddit endgame, so I'm interested to see how it plays out with the new meta.
Oh shit! I have
Ah,
to keep my eyes on that one.
yeah. And next up, this is a very, very popular question. When balancing the game, how many hours do you expect or estimate it should take for an average player to get to the end game and access fights like Uber Elder, Maven, and general content? What is an average player in GGG's eyes?
Who's
I had a good
this?
discussion with the team. This one. The idea of what is an average player and how long does it take them to get to content. And the thing is, like, if you look at an average player of people who come to our website and are interested in the game, the average player doesn't get through the download necessarily, right? Like the average player decides halfway through they're going to go and watch Netflix. And if you look at people who actually get the game installed, the average player doesn't get to Brutus, right? This is irrelevant. We don't care about the
Yeah.
people who just don't care enough to get to Brutus, right? So what are we caring about? The average player who gets past Brutus? They don't get to maps. Okay, so obviously we do care a bit about that because we do want them to have a good time playing through the campaign. It's a pretty like
Yeah.
some dude who's heard about my game as a friend and wants to play it. I'm fine if he just plays through 8 acts of the thing to get an idea of what I've made. But the average player, as far as Reddit is concerned, is deep into red maps and caring a lot about the questions in here. So there are so many types of average players, and we want the game to be appropriate for everyone. And so we try to make sure that the early game, like Act 1 and stuff, is appropriate for below average players. Just randoms. Yeah, it's we're making sure it's got its teeth back in it, as we've discussed, but we do care about the fact that low skill players have to be able to play through Act 1. We make sure the mid game is appropriate for actual average players. We make sure it's possible to get to maps without having to learn everything in the world. And we want to make sure that the end game is appropriate for above average players, and that the pinnacle content is appropriate for Havoc and Steel Mage, basically. We know that people aspire to go to the next tier above where they are. So a person who's just getting through Act 1, they want to be able to see the rest of the campaign, and they can't quite get there. So we want to make sure the path to getting from below average to somewhat average is achievable, and all the way up the chain. We want to make sure that someone who is playing in red maps and wants to be a complete overachiever has a path to be able to, have that pinnacle content be as easy for them. So this is a bit of a non-answer, I understand.
Yeah.
But we care a lot about different types of players, and we want to make sure there aren't any bumps in the journey for them.
So do you not have any rough number of how many hours you would like an average player to be able to complete endgame content?
Not really. It really depends on a lot of factors that we can't control. Like it depends what builds are meta. Sure, we could ask QA, go benchmark it a few times and try to play at a reasonable pace and get a number for you, but I don't know if that's really helping, right? Like, we'd probably want the number to be bigger, so I'm not sure it's sensible for us to try to work out what the number is,
Right. And do you want the average player to be able to complete things like Maven, Uber Elder, etc., or do you want that to be specifically something for a very small group of players?
If the question is, should 50% of the people that play Path of Exile be able to complete the absolute hardest content in the game, then I think the answer is no, that would be undesirable. That would cause the other players to find it too easy, or to get through it too quickly, or whatever, right? Like whatever metric, whether it's hard through skill, whether it's hard through time, they would have a big problem. Having said that, I want it so for the people here who tune in to watch this podcast, who choose to sit there through hours of me talking and embarrassing myself, those people should be able to see all the content of the game. They care, they're smart, they're involved, and yeah, if they're struggling to get through to the end game stuff, that's a problem. But there are 21,000 people watching your channel here, plus some others who are restreaming, and a bunch of people that will watch it later, maybe a few 100,000 people. But that's a few 100,000 people out of millions that have played this league, right? Like that's 10% of the content of these engaged players that I'm targeting here. So yeah, I want them to be able to get to the end game and have a good time.
Right.
People
Right.
are questioning the word millions. We do have millions of people try each league. Even when we're down 30% of players, that's still a 7-digit number.
Yeah.
Like, sorry, anyway, I won't get defensive with chat. That's a whole...
Fake news.
Okay. Right. Last question about the Atlas/Endgame is: are there any plans to make changes to multiplayer? Not being able to progress your own Atlas while playing with somebody else is so sad.
So you can progress Atlas completion, of which maps you've completed, and your Maven map witnessing, but your Watchstone progression is one of the things that doesn't progress. Having said that, when we're designing 317, we're aware of the fact that people want to have the ability to progress in multiplayer, and this will be much more of a consideration. In the past, whenever we've made a decision that's hurt multiplayer like this, it's usually because it's of abuse cases or shortcutting or quest states or that kind of thing. But there are smarter ways to design stuff so that people can make full progress without being able to shortcut things or abuse it. We just want to make sure, like, a lot of our weird decisions are so that the correct behavior isn't to have 6 Path of Exile clients open across 3 computers on your desk and get full value out of having a 6-person party for some reason. Right now, there is little, if any, incentive for you multi-boxing Path of Exile. It's in a somewhat good state where people who play with their friends do get some benefits, plays into the whole Aurobot discussion, and people who play solo are still getting to see all the content of the game, probably at a more efficient rate. And this is I know it can be improved, but it's not a terrible situation. Like, the second you feel punished for being in a party or punished for not having 6 clients open that you're manually micromanaging, then that's a problem. But yeah, to answer your question, we will make sure that multiplayer is more considered for future endgame stuff.
Nice. Okay. Next up, we have a big one. So, and just to confirm, right? You guys are fairly recently, maybe it's like a few years ago now. It feels fairly recently in my head. But initially, Path of Exile was balanced for hardcore trade league. And then at some point that changed, and the game is now being generally bouncing around softcore trade league, correct?
I don't remember. I can't find anyone at work who remembers us saying that, by the way. So sure, we've always been balancing around the standard one because that's where people are playing. Like, hardcore's meant to be hard.
Yeah.
Maybe it wasn't a thing because most of our developers were playing hardcore because it's better or something.
Yeah.
But yeah, we
I
do
don't
care about.
remember you guys ever saying that. It was just more of like a feeling that it was, the game was more friendly towards hardcore back then, and it's progressively gotten less so.
Okay,
Yeah, either way, we are balancing around standard trade, if that's what you're asking. And
yes.
I'm using the word standard to avoid saying softcore, just because that's not a term GGG uses. We use standard to refer to the non-hardcore one, which is
what do you call standard then?
Actual standard. I know, it's confusing. It's not great, right? Like, I get the semantics are weird.
Right. Okay. Well. Okay. Sweet. we can try to find that because I know it's been said in the past. But anyway, with that in mind, defenses are sort of systematically getting nerfed patch after patch, and that encourages more players to go glass cannon builds and try to one-shot screen after screen. Because you were talking about on Baeclast, right? That players are just trying to one-shot the next screen over. Well, a big reason for that is because if they don't, those monsters will one-shot the player back. So defenses are getting so light nerfed repeatedly, and on softcore, then people are just more and more incentivized to just go very, very glass cannon. And obviously hardcore is struggling more and more, but that's besides the point. Why are defenses getting nerfed so hard repeatedly?
So I talked to the team about defenses, and the best we can do is a statement that we are looking into defenses in 316, right? This conversation spiraled in every direction with arguments about every defense and how worthwhile it is investing in it. And there was a lot there. And I don't think that repeating it all is going to do much other than confirm the fact that there are some things that are in a bad place. So we've put it on the list of 316 has to include work on defenses. Now, we haven't yet started that work on defenses because we're still arguing about what the problem is. And we have good resources from the community, and a lot of people have opinions here. Yeah. But yeah, it needs some work, and it's going to get some. So a slight concern we have is we'd already scoped 316 out to be a compelling set of stuff and a bunch of changes, and we didn't really have defenses on our radar there. Our fault, I guess. And then, especially after last week's podcast, where we dumped a pile of things into 316 scope, and with this commitment to, of course, work on defenses and any other promises we've made, it is causing 316 to get kind of big. And that's worrying me from a production point of view, because big means either bad quality or overtime or cutting features. So cutting features is going to be the one we probably do. So the scope may change. Like, for example, if we can't find a way of dealing with defense as well. Maybe that gets pushed to the next one, or maybe some other feature like the guild stuff gets pushed. I don't know. We'll work something out, but we do want to make sure that we don't overcommit ourselves to 316. Having said that, to be honest, out of all the topics we've discussed here, defenses sounds like the most important one, right? Like that's affecting pretty much every PoE player. So I think that's definitely worth exploring with priority.
Yeah, and it also seems like so you guys have expressed an interest into slowing down the game, right? And defenses sort of do that naturally. If you're incentivizing people that are playing softcore into making strong defenses, then you are in turn just getting less people um going around making these class cannon builds. And I've talked to a lot like so many people are trying to make it out to be that software players are slapping something and saying, I paid for 6 portals, I'm using them, right? But the more and more I talk to software players, and Mathil can chime in here, but software players don't seem to enjoy dying. So, yeah, definitely strong defenses are seemingly valued by both sides.
We'll see what we can do. And I'm sorry for not coming to your question with here's the plan for defenses
Sure.
and then having an actual engagement with you. But the best we can do is a promise that you have to do something. And maybe the solution there, like as I mentioned last week, we're not just going to surprise people on live stream day with here are the changes, you will like them. That doesn't work.
Yeah.
We'll come up with them and discuss it with the community, which means, get the game back together and we'll talk about it in a month once we've planned it, right? Like have a good discussion about what the pros and cons are.
Yeah.
I want to mention, by the way, after I just said, oh yeah, we'll probably, we need to cut some features, maybe the guild stuff. That particular thing is being done by other team members because it's infrastructure, so it's not really the people working on defenses. So if we do the guild stuff, which I'd like to do, then that's not at the cost of other important gameplay stuff. It's probably gameplay content that has to be shuffled around to get the defenses stuff in.
Yeah. Like just to like mention it as well, like some things that like the old flasks really help be a band-aid for defenses in the game there, because obviously like the Jade flask being at 3k, Granite flask being at 3k, really help with like generic mapping. Like you can make a kind of very tanky build for bosses, but then dealing for the onslaught that is maps without dodge or without block right now is what a lot of people are really struggling with. And obviously Basalt flask was, it's a very niche thing now, right? It's not many builds are going to want to do percentage armor. One of the biggest
The
problems.
team were concerned with the power level coming from Flasks, and that's why there were nerfs to those, but, that doesn't mean we can't have defenses as an option. And this was explained well to me by a friend of mine who's given me some good feedback, who basically explained that, Chris, I care about defenses and I have all of them. There's nothing more to do, and I still die randomly. And sure, there's going to be a degree of still being one shot if you overcommit to a situation, but clearly it's in the wrong place at the moment, right? Like clearly it needs to be that you feel that there is always more defenses that you can invest into, so you can choose to sacrifice damage for defenses more effectively.
Yeah. Good.
Is there more support coming for Ward, the new sort of mechanic and system? Or is it just like a league type thing and then it's being thrown away? Because at the moment it's a bit hard to build around or like utilize powerfully.
We had this discussion. I asked that exact question during the design of Ward. Like, is this a thing that's just going to be for this league? And the answer was that once things are part of the core game in the future, like once Expedition, because I emphasize Expedition is not necessarily coming back immediately, but once it's decided when it's coming back, and Ward is a thing that's now an evergreen part of the game, it probably will branch out more and more. So this depends on whether Expedition is coming back. I'd like it to, but this is not a decision that we've, confirmed when or where or how. I mean, obviously changes are always required, especially with splinters.
Ward splinters. Also, I did kind of want to touch on the softcore thing. I don't know if it really ties into anything we were talking about, but it is kind of like difficult to balance what you're doing in softcore compared to hardcore with defenses, because you start out with your hardcore at a certain amount of defense and you go, okay, I'll probably live and I'll probably, be fine. Time to start adding some DPS and some other stuff. And the challenge in softcore isn't just like going ahead and, zerging away through the game. It is saying no to some of those offenses and then building defenses, because it's so tempting. And I don't want to throw my good friend Quinn69 under the bus, but that's exactly, you could see it very much in his first attempt on softcore, that he's on there and he wants all the DPS, and then he skips out on a lot of the defense and then dies a lot, and then it feels bad. And the challenge is saying no to some of that damage and then still building some defense. And it's hard to do. And that's why I'm always building paper thin characters, right? I'm known for my 4K life builds. But it's basically just always going for the bare minimum of defense and life to survive so many situations and still squeak by. And that's kind of the entire point there. It's the challenge is in saying no to damage and then still building some defense.
That's a good way of looking at it.
Yeah, very interesting, different way. I just have to cling on for dear life. Um, and speaking, we mentioned briefly on Basil Flask. Obviously, we've also lost a large amount of fizz reduction, like percentage fizz reduction. Has that been talked about already? Like different sources? Then obviously we lost Basil Flask and we've lost skill points from the tree. We have very limited, like it's mostly endurance charges right now, and then a few fizz damage taken as elemental.
It'll be discussed as part of the defenses discussion. I don't have any specific information there.
Yeah. Next up, monsters are also obviously incredibly scary right now. And a lot of people were mentioning that the nerfs to us, like the player being nerfed so much, felt a little bit out of place when the monsters were getting even stronger than before and didn't get touched, and like one shots and stuff being more and more frequent, and that there's a big discrepancy between monsters and what we can defend against right now. Is that being looked at right now as well, or are monsters intended to be terrifying?
So, in the Act 1 scariness project, we made Act 1 scary and made the monsters hard. And, like, a lot of the rip clips we see are Act 1 monsters, like rowers and stuff, taking
Yeah.
people out. Two things to note here. Number one is there were some cases there where we went too far. There were cases where we chose the wrong values, didn't test enough, didn't catch it. Mistakes were made. We have tightened up our policies here to make sure that we're being more careful with the monster balance stuff in the future. Like, we're going to make sure that when we're doing the scariness project for Acts 2 through 10, it's done in a way that doesn't cause quite so much danger. So yes, we're fixing the monsters. However, we are making Acts 2 through 10 scary as well. So overall, monsters will be harder, but hopefully not above the line that you're talking about.
Right.
So, like, the problem there is that, yeah, you're doing an Act 1 and you know certain zones, like there's going to be rowers here, and you expect to clench, and then you are prepared for it, right? And it's a scary situation, and you're certain, you adjust for it. If you just incorporate all of that into all of the maps, and all of a sudden, you can't just play like hours on end while mapping and just be constantly shitting yourself because everything's about to destroy you, right? It's just not that much of an enjoyable experience at the end of the day. So you gotta, some monsters need to be toned down to the point where they're not hitting harder than Cirrus just because they've got a special mod on them, right?
Yep.
Even though it's coming out of nowhere.
Yeah, our target is that you can play Path of Exile and mostly feel safe and secure, kind of zoning out a bit, and then get randomly screwed over by some combination of mods. If you're not paying attention, like, it wakes you up a bit, which is better than it just being constantly grindy and scary. We want it so that there's a level of getting complacent followed by death through mistake.
See, I think people for the most part are happy with that if they're like interacting with something. If they're choosing to do something like Legion or Metamorph, right? Then you're actively choosing something dangerous. I think people are less happy about one shots when they turn a corner and there was something like already released there that just is a unavoidable one shot. Of like, let's say auras, right? Like auras with which you already addressed here at Baeclast with the aura stacking. Okay, the next thing up at the moment, Cyrus monsters. A lot of people were bringing this up, and that they were very, very scary, and are, yeah, just incredibly powerful. Is that being looked at?
I mean, we're smiling. We're aware of the feedback. It's it's good to hear. We kind of do like monsters being scary, in the right places, especially when they're quite important ones.
About something that's barely a monster, like a Drox flag that just,
I've died to that.
infused by Cirrus, has a few random mods, comes out of the sky, oh look, 8,000 damage. It's like, hey, that's fair.
Yeah, I know. We'll have a look.
Yeah. Okay, so this ties. Bethel brushed on this earlier when talking about Oshami. Some bosses are extremely random as to how a player accesses the fight. So, like Ultimatum, we have the mechanic there. We had Owl in Delve. And how do you feel about that type of fight? Are you more leaning towards things like, Shaper, which is like still RNG, but you are probably going to fight Shaper in a league, and same with like Awakener, right? There's some RNG there, but like a lot more deterministic. Are we going to see less or more fights like Owl and Trial Master?
Well, if you've got some monster that spawns every 70 maps, one way to make it more deterministic could be to drop an item
Like a
splinter.
splinter. um,
Oh,
but
I'd
it
love to click on
it
one of
doesn't
those.
necessarily have to be something you pick up and that is tradable as well.
That's true. But in all seriousness, we want to make these bosses more accessible in smart ways. So here's a couple of things. So we're doing a delve rebalance in 316, or at least intending to if we can find time. And the goal here is to make all more common, like as in you get more access to cities and that kind of stuff. Like the goal is it's not as hard to find him.
Nice.
If Ultimatum comes back to core, we're going to look at smarter ways to access the Trial Master. Like, there's good suggestions from the community. Like, for example, the longer your winning streak is between subsequent rounds, the more likely the Trial Master is to occur. Because that actually gives you a strategy, a thing you can do to try to make it a bit more common. I mean, at the end of the day, the rare bosses with rare drops are going to be rare, but having some way to control it and feel a bit more involved in the process will be good, so that we don't have to do the splinter approach.
Yeah.
That's what I actually thought the Trial Master was to begin with. I'm like, oh, I'm just not winning enough things, often enough. I got to be getting to the very end. People are like, yeah, I've been winning 10 and I've seen like 2 Trial Masters, but it was all like, just assumption or just,
Yeah.
anecdotal evidence, really.
Yeah, like I've been incredibly unlucky with both Owl and the Trial Master. My spawn rate was 0.0186 or something on Trial Master. Found him
I think we
twice.
actually went over this and established you don't play enough.
I posted my map watch.
You're just a filthy casual, Ziz. Got to bump yourself up to Mathel numbers because I saw so many Trial Masters.
Okay, you want to go there? Um, we can go there if you want.
I'm fine.
Okay, so another question this got asked a lot by players, and Brutus. The waypoint seems very, very far away where you spawn now. Like if you die to Brutus, you have to run like all the way back. And another thing about Brutus as well is he no longer summons monsters to give you their flash charges or resummon zombies. If you're a zombie fighter, you just have to leave.
We don't have a problem with either of these currently when we examine it. We might tone Brutus's life down potentially a bit, but it's more likely we do that. We don't feel that we should have to add fodder minions to every single boss in the game, especially that early. Like, it's... Yeah, for various reasons, the fight is how it currently is, and we're pretty happy with it being there.
Okay.
It's just a straight up deal with it. Yep.
Or zombie summoners.
Just don't play Summoner, dude.
So whenever you're doing the Maven fight at the moment, sometimes there's a very small chance that it just releases all the bosses. This doesn't seem to be deterministic. It's like, oh, I'm powerful enough. I want to fight all them fast. It's just sometimes appears. A lot of people thought it was a bug for a while, but it is confirmed to be an intentional feature. Why is that?
Because their team thought it was awesome. They also will take it out. Sure, it's gone.
No, don't do that.
It would probably be good to have as an optional thing for people that are strong enough.
Yeah, upon reflection, they're happy to remove that one. It was not the best variant.
There is a lot of people that do like it as well, though. So like, you can have a middle ground.
I thought that's literally how you marketed the actual like implementation of that you will be fighting all of whatever's in there at once. So when I first came across it and it's like spawning one at a time, I was like, oh,
Yeah.
well, this is way nicer and easier. So then when it did happen 10 at once, I was like, oh my god, Jesus. And, it's, I don't know, I thought it was fine.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like there does seem to be room for both.
Yeah.
Okay. And going back to defenses a little bit, how do you want players to go about defenses? Do you want us to be reactive or do you want us to be proactive? Because obviously you talked a little bit about you're adding, you're changing up a little bit how things work with life flasks and utility flasks, which seems really exciting. But it does feel a lot in Path of Exile that with everything that is reactive, we have very little time to react. It is very much like if you aren't proactive, you're dead.
So with the flasks in 316, utility flasks will be purely proactive ones. They're ones where all the mods and stuff synergize with you using them before the damage occurs. And
Mhm.
so there'll be lots and lots and lots of proactive there. Life and mana ones, of course, because you're always using those after you take damage. It's pointless to doing them beforehand. They're the
Yeah.
ones that have the reactive mods on it. And so our previous version of the flask system just, didn't think of that properly, right? Like we've had a good think about that now. So it'll be better in 316 because we agree there's a place for very proactive play.
Okay. Sweet. A lot of people are asking if you can elaborate some of what you've been thinking with Fortify and if it is going to be similar to Cruelty. And for the builds currently using Fortify, will they have like something to make up for it that is like different and more build specific? A lot of people bring up that there is no dexterity guard skill, for example.
I got in trouble for talking about Fortify last time, so I'm not going to talk about Fortify.
Right.
We'll talk about it once we know. We're still working on it, so our intention is to work out the solution to it and then discuss it. But we don't have that yet because we randomly got plunged into lockdown a few days ago, and that's disruptive, and so a few
Yeah.
topics were postponed.
That makes sense. I mean, and I think a lot of people are appreciating how open you guys are being. So
We're trying.
right. Here's another very big one. So this is something that I feel like has been a lot of miscommunication about, and this is build diversity. Because we like the community is saying build diversity is bad, build diversity sucks, and you guys start looking at your internal tools and you go, well, build diversity doesn't seem to be worse now than in leagues where people are pretty happy with it. Like, for example, I asked my community, guys, when was build diversity good? And people would say like, oh, Harvest. Harvest was really good. Or Ritual. And when we looked at like old PoE Ninja stats or old stats that we had access to, build diversity wasn't necessarily different or better than now. And there's a couple of reasons for that. A lot of people don't want to gamble with their time, right? If you're a casual player, you have a limited amount of hours anyway. So you're going to go like, okay, well, Mathil is playing this build as his league starter. That is going to be a secure league starter. Steel Mage and Zizaran are both playing the same build. These are now secure league starters. But when they stop playing that build, that's still in the statistics, right? So you're always going to have very little build diversity in Path of Exile. What a lot of people, and this is a very important thing, what a lot of people are unhappy about is build viability. That when they have done this first build and invested into unlocking their Atlas, invested into unlocking currency, they don't have the same amount of options of new interesting builds to try in this league that they maybe had before. Some of that is through defense, but also like just less meta builds are working than before. And like you said, like a lot of people always play a certain meta, right? There's always going to be low build diversity. But build viability, I really want to drive home this different because that's very important to a lot of people.
So let's tackle the two topics separately. And I understand that you're calling out the main point you want to make as the viability one rather than the diversity point.
Yes.
But I got a good email about build diversity yesterday from, I'm going to read you the email. Sorry, this is just going to take a second, but it's worthwhile. So, a gentleman wrote in and said, "Hey Chris, longtime PoE player and graduate researcher here who specializes in complex systems and emergent phenomena. You're going to be asked about build diversity by Zizaran on your next interview. And he mentioned something in his previous video, it'd be great if the most played build was only 4%, which suggests that we need to discuss the concept of preferential attachment and cumulative advantage. So he says, I've analyzed data for the most played skills on all ascendancy classes in SSF hardcore and softcore trade, comparing them to purely random preferential attachment distributions. His conclusion is the distribution of played skills in either league conforms with a cumulative advantage / preferential attachment mechanism. So he says, he basically sees a mechanism that works as follows. So number one is, a few build guides are put out at the beginning of the league by a few big creators like Ziz and Mathil, leading to most players playing one of the few builds that they've seen a guide for, because obviously people will use guides. Some of the builds will randomly rise to the top first. So here he's making the assumption that if all the builds are equally powerful, then some of them will randomly rise to the top. Players looking for new builds will see the top builds and are more likely to pick one of the builds with and are more likely to pick one of those builds rather than a build with very few players, even if it's perfectly competitive. And then a million perfectly viable skills get next to no attention because everyone plays one of the top few builds. So he says this is an emergent phenomenon based out of social psychology, and would imagine that in PoE with risk aversion, there's risk aversion and analysis paralysis as well. And so he comments at the end of the day, the build creators are trying hard to make interesting build guides to help people have something to play, but it actually creates a little bit of the problem where it seeds the randomness that kind of stacks on top. And so this is something that, like, I've tried to touch on before. He's just explaining it in a much better way because it's what he does for a job.
But
And so I think we're all of the same agreement here that even if stuff were perfectly balanced from a diversity point of view, we'd still see this kind of like stacking effect that we get where certain things are popular. But your core point was about viability, which is an entirely different topic, I understand. So that to the side.
no, but that is exactly what I said at the start, just with bigger words.
Mm. Yeah, I understand. But I'm helping to, phrase it for the audience as well. And because I
Right.
liked his email, it was a good one.
Okay.
But with the viability thing. So let me just find what notes I made.
Also, now my head hurts. That was a lot of big words.
It was a good one, and I really appreciated it. So I talked to the team about the viability question, right? And from what we can see, this is getting better over time because every balance change that we're doing is taking a skill that's too good and reducing it, which is good for viability because there's more viable builds, or taking a skill that's too bad and increasing it. And while we occasionally go too far in one direction or too far in the other, each change is meant to be moving stuff towards an average. And this has been going on for a decade now. Skills have been pushed to be more homogenous in terms of average power level, and ditto with support gems and so on and so on. And so from our point of view here, we see vast swaths of viable builds. Now, we understand that the feeling of the players is that there are fewer meta builds and few really powerful ones. We still see a lot of these, and we feel it's not our position to really tell the players how to play. I guess we could publish GGG sanctioned build guides of ones that are really powerful, but players work them out themselves. And we kind of want a discussion of what do you guys want from this? Do you what's the change that you're asking for us to make with regard to viability of skills? Do you just want us to just randomly buff them? That's the equivalent of nerfing monsters, do you want us to start giving hints as to which the good ones are?
No, but obviously, we pointed out, Harvest and Ritual were examples people brought up where they felt like they had a more diverse things they could approach as a second build, and that's what they're feeling is a low amount right now. People like Mathel and people that play a shit ton, right? You're probably going to be able to make most builds work, but a lot of players are just feeling like there's a shit ton less builds that are viable this league that can handle the content in the game than before.
Maybe this is due to the meta shakeup, right? The feedback that we had before was the builds are kind of known. There's a bunch of powerful builds. We're going to play those, but we've played them a bunch already. And if we release new content, like new skills, it's going to be assessed against the powerful builds, and either it's more powerful, in which case it replaces one on the list, and that's terrible, I should add, for us to release something that's more powerful than the best meta skills. Or it's worse than those, in which case don't care, it's gone. And those that established that these are the skills to play are just sitting there. And people asked for a meta shakeup, right? So we changed a bunch of stuff, and now people are saying, I cannot identify builds that are viable. That to us reads as the community needs to do more work to find more viable builds and to reestablish themselves in this pattern of knowing where things are at. So I suspect that this confusion about what second build to play is been previously labeled as a desirable thing, but is actually maybe part of the problem here. It could be that actually doing a meta shakeup hurts us. Maybe it contributed to a lack of interest in playing this particular league because there's less obvious build guides for something powerful for someone to play.
But we've had meta shakeups in the past that have been very desirable. Oh, nice, we don't have to play Blade Blast for the 7th league in a row or Essence Strain for the 12th league in a row, right? That has been desirable. But there's a big difference here where...
That hasn't happened, though.
Hmm?
That hasn't happened previously. That might be happening right now, where Blade Blast is less viable and all of a sudden people won't play it as much. But prior to that, Blade Blast has still been good. Essence Strain
Okay,
still is
I'm
good.
not talking about those as the specific examples, but we have obviously had big meta shakeups during the years.
Well, the thing about all of this is there have been big meta shakeups in the past, and I think it's just a different player base these days. It is entirely the player base's fault right now, I'm gonna say, because we have had big meta shakeups in the past, and ones that seem just mind-blowingly I don't know what to do, right? So like double dipping, for example, like taking away energy shield power, Val pacts, all of these. And back then, more or less, yeah, there's some crying. Yeah, it's difficult, but we've adjusted to it. We found powerful shit, sometimes more powerful shit than ever before. Currently, no one seemed to want to do that because there aren't as many people wanting to experiment with builds and try builds. They still work, and there are still like diamonds in the rough out there, maybe more so than ever, because I can't stop thinking about builds I want to try out. And I can look at several different content creators that are just pumping out build after build after build that are working. So I think it's just people aren't like doing enough on their end to play Path of Exile the way Path of Exile was meant to be played, through experimentation and, you know, figuring things out.
I mean, I as another player that plays a lot, I disagree. I would say build viability is very low this league. A big portion of that is the defenses that we talked about earlier. You either need dodge or block on your build, or you're going to fall over in maps. Because Flasks are no longer the band-aid they used to be. That is, in my opinion, the biggest problem right now. That you don't have a band-aid without block or dodge.
Well, let's see how we go
Yeah.
with the defensive stuff.
Yeah, I think that would up build viability a lot.
So how many things have you tried that have just failed because of the new patch?
So far, like Forbidden Right, I tried that multiple times. You can't really get easy access.
You died because of the logout macro and not adjusting to the playstyle of not having a logout macro.
The build doesn't work well without block or dodge. That's the entire thing. You get most competent PoE
totem
players
build.
right now would agree that a build without block or dodge really struggles.
It struggles to take damage, yes, but the totem playstyle is one of defensiveness where you place your totems, you run around, and you don't take damage. And if that's what you were doing with the totem playstyle and trying to avoid confrontation, it works, and it's fine, and it's playable. Like, are you trying to tell me there aren't totem Forbidden Right builds on hardcore right now that are having good success?
I mean, they're at a disadvantage compared to builds that have block or dodge for mapping. That's just straight up fact.
It's not about being at a disadvantage. It's about being still viable and good.
Of course it is. Of course that is what it's about. That is the entire conversation.
Why does it
build
matter
viability.
if Spectral Shield Throw is the fastest, easiest thing out there, while Forbidden Right totems are still viable and they still work and they are playable?
I mean, this is something a lot of people are complaining about. And again, of course, you are not going to. Right, but you are 0.1% of the 0.1%.
Why am I being put on trial for this thing? I'm saying a lot of people are playing these and they are working. It's not just me. Chris, anything to say to all of this?
I can't say this on stream, but I agree with Methel, but we're still going to look into it, right? We're still going to take Ziz's stuff at face value and say, let's investigate this and let's try to improve defenses and let's see what the community are talking about. Because there's two player bases here, right? There's guys who are fine with it and guys who are not fine with it, and we'll work out something for everyone. Like, it'll get looked at. And yeah, but
don't say
I
it
appreciate
on stream, though.
Yeah. And again, I'm trying very hard to represent a lot of people in the community here that don't necessarily have a voice.
Yeah, we appreciate that. And I appreciate you saying what you said as well, Methel. It's good to get balance, right? Like, I think I have your email address wrong. Like, PayPal's saying it doesn't. Sorry, never mind.
Okay.
Oh my god, no, it cleared. It cleared fine. That's
Is that the
Okay,
Spectral
sweet.
Throw revenue?
Checks coming. Hey, dying streamer over here playing a game that is just, you know, what can I do?
Yeah. Like, at least it's something a lot of people have brought up. But anyway, like something I'm very interested in then, which is a good follow-up point, is can you talk a little bit about balance in Path of Exile? Very often, some changes can be very heavy-handed. Is the goal to balance skills, or are you just trying to shake things up so you're okay with like killing a skill and aware that you're doing it? Because sometimes it doesn't seem like you're trying to balance the skill and make it worse. Sometimes it does in fact kill the skill completely. So walk us through the goals of balance patches.
Well, there's this perception that when we nerf a skill, it's dead, right? That our goal is to take it out back and shoot it. But that's not what we're trying to do. When we adjust a skill, which is our polite internal terminology for nerf, or buff, we want it to be in a good place. Like, our goal is to nerf from a point which is distorting the game to a point which is fun still and powerful, right? Like, we want every skill to be at 110%, as it were. So theoretically, if we nerf a skill, that should be a sign that it can be played, because A, it's had attention recently, so it's not likely to be randomly nerfed again soon, and B, it's in a state that's still fun and powerful. But the perception with players is it's nerfed, let's not play it anymore, and they just cross it off the list of what they need to appreciate, in terms of investigate. Now, obviously, we get this wrong sometimes. I should add, this is the goal and the average result, but not the one every time. So the next thing to note is that when we look at the top builds that are being played in a given league, it's a random assortment of skills that were nerfed a long time ago that are now being used in conjunction with some new clever technique, right? Like, there's just Ice Spear being used somehow in 2021. Like, I'm in my late 30s and people are using Ice Spear in Path of Exile in conjunction with stuff that I don't understand, and this is good to see. People should be more willing to give skills a try after we nerf them, right? Like, we're cutting a few % off something that's way overpowered still keeps it pretty damn overpowered.
Right. Yeah, no.
How often is the sort of system to, like you said, just go out back and shoot a skill? Like, does that happen in your mind terribly often, or why would that happen to some
I can't
as
think
well?
of a case where we want to nerf a skill to the point where it shouldn't be played. Like, whenever you see us revamp a skill so it works differently, that's taking out back and coming back with a dog that's slightly different, right? Like, that's us changing a skill, basically removing it from the game and adding a new one that's got the same name.
Right. All right. They said the reason they're nerfing gems was because they want bosses to actually fight back and for players to not kill them before they can even attack. So you're thinking late game characters are too powerful. If that is the case, why are they nerfing the ground and not the ceiling? If they want a nerfed late game, there should be nerfing influence mods, etc., not nerfing the early game. So basically, where you're nerfing the ceiling and not the roof and not the ceiling.
So my understanding here is you're asking why would we nerf, say, support gems that everyone has to use. That was one of the examples there. And part of the reason is because higher level characters have more support gems, right? The 6-link guy's got 5 support gems, whereas the 2-link guy's got 1 support.
I think a lot of people are saying it feels like you're trying to nerf the 0.1% and then the 10% is getting hit.
Right. We do intentionally nerf high-end characters as well, like the explodey chests and that kind of stuff. We are trying to nerf the top end, right? But we're doing it sometimes with things that affect everyone when we feel it's the best choice. And I think the solution here is that we just need to be more clear about this. What is interesting, though, is that with our nerfs that we did for the last expansion, we knew that we had to be clear, and so we devoted half the live stream to explaining stuff, and we devoted a very large, incredibly long balance manifesto and patch notes and thing, and they went some other way. And I'm not saying we're going to stop doing that. We do want to keep explaining stuff, but maybe we need to add to that podcasts like this where we take a bunch of balance changes before we make them and come and just chat about it, so that there's the opportunity to ask these questions for pending changes. Because this question is a good one, but it's a theoretical one. Like, why are you nerfing the ground rather than the ceiling isn't about a specific skill and what we're trying to achieve. But next time we have a specific set of nerfs, maybe we should chat about those and help reassure people that it's going to be better with the changes.
What's the harm in I know you try to shy away from ever doing this and saying you won't make changes like mid-patch or, mid-league or something. What's the harm in actually stating before you go into a big league? Here's a lot of balance changes for gems and stuff, and some may be very overpowered because we've done a lot, but if it's overpowered, we may rebalance this, let's say 2 weeks in. So get your testing in, play your stuff. If it's going to be overpowered, we will potentially look at a lot of things and just tweak a few numbers 2 weeks in, so that it gives you more freedom to do more heavy-handed changes on the fly.
As a developer, I would totally love that, but we've received such negative feedback in the past by mid-league changes, and it's partly because you throw your entire character and resources and time at this crucial start of a league into a particular build, and if we come in and go, yeah, it's 40% worse now, deal with it, then it's just so demoralizing, right? We probably can't be doing that. So we are trying very hard to stay away from mid-league nerfs and buffs as well, to be honest, because there's that situation where you invest in a character and then the one that you chose not to play because you deemed it to be too weak is suddenly buffed up above what you chose to play. Is kind of a nerf by proxy to you. Now, this league we have done some mid-league buffs where we realize that there's very big mistakes that were made with numbers, like on launch day, just doubling the life of the Reaper. Is something we knew we could slip in there right then because the Reaper character is still testing out the Reaper at that stage and hasn't completely abandoned it. Now, with regard to having a thing where 2 weeks in we make some changes, that would make development a lot easier if we could say that. And it would be nice to be really clear with players that, hey, look, things might change after 2 weeks, but honestly, the negative reaction would be so bad. Like it's just such a feel bad moment for the players when it happens. And I also feel that it would discourage our staff from trying to make the right decisions or the right testing beforehand, because there would be this crutch of we're fixing it in 2 weeks once the beta is over. The problem is that the first 2 weeks of launch is meant to be the fun part of the league, where things are good, as opposed to an extended beta. And of course, this raises the question of should we have a public test realm and various things like that, which aren't compatible with the way that we develop our patches, not from a technical point of view, but just from a time point of view.
Right.
Bigger topic, something to look
And
forward to in the future, I guess, if we can manage it.
so that is actually something I really want to ask you about then. Did you get negative backlash for Absolution and Reaper being buffed mid league? Because I would be kind of surprised if you do get negative backlash from things being buffed, like things that are virtually or literally unplayable getting some love mid league. That generally seems like a good thing to most people.
I think that if we're going to be putting the effort into buffing random things, we should just do it before the patch. Like if I'm going to just double the damage of Glacial Hammer, it's happening before launch and in the patch notes so people can consider it when they're considering their builds. I think it's still a bit of a feel bad too. You're playing your one thing and then you find out that Glacial Hammer is the new in skill and you just didn't know that when you chose what to invest your resources in. It was just a lottery what got the treatment. I don't think we got bad backlash for the buffs. I mean, the fact that buffs were necessary caused some people to question
Yeah.
our development skills. Like
Mhm.
certainly that, was an overall a bad thing. But just because we didn't receive backlash for fixing them probably doesn't mean we should have a policy of randomly buffing stuff after people have picked what characters they're going to play.
Right. I'm definitely more on the side of being pro mid league buffs here, I gotta say. Right. Okay, we're on to miscellaneous. Path of Exile must be collecting an enormous amount of data from users in regards to how they play. How much data goes into the decision that you and teams make overall? So, for example, like the Atlas reduction, right? Was that based on data? And what other areas are like very important?
So we're careful with data. I know people who run game companies who they'll load up the data and they'll look at it and there's a big table there and they'll say, what is happening with the data today? Oh, look, level 7 characters are logging out sooner than everyone else by 12%. What's going on at level 7? Let's find something and change it, right? Entirely data-driven stuff. We hide the data from our staff until they have a good question, right? When a person says, is Fireball used more often than Ice Spear? We will answer that question for them, but it has to be phrased as a question. We are very careful to not just load up the data and try to go searching for problems. So we don't know if there are 100 out of 160 maps that are more popular. We believe 100 is about the right number because we understand what the fun will be. We don't want the data to tell us what the fun is. And so we'll use data wherever. Like I'm looking forward to going through the data of user engagement for hard mode stuff and making good decisions based on it. But it's going to be a question of asking questions rather than just looking at tables of stuff. And I'll give you an example. We had a table of where people are up to quest state rise, like where the quest state of a character is up to and how many users are left. So this starts at 100% of users are sitting there on the beach with a quest state of, they haven't killed Hillock yet. And this gets smaller as you go through the game, right? The number of people who have got past Katava in Act 10 is a fraction of what it is for the quest state at the start. And so you can look at this graph and see where the big drops are. And so there was a big drop in Act 3. And the big drop occurred right at the beginning with the Clarissa quest, to do with the quest state of having rescued Clarissa outside town or not. And so the conclusion was drawn and bandied around a bit, not actually by any of our GGG stuff. This was by an external person looking at some of our data, thankfully. But the conclusion was drawn that there was something wrong with the Clarissa quest because there's like an 18% drop of players related to that period of time. Like when someone's on the Clarissa quest, you lose 18% of players. And so there was a lot of questions of, no, it's because she's this distance away from town, it's because you're going to walk past her and not see her, it's because there needs to be an icon above it, there needs to be, we can change the environment to make it more clear. Maybe the dialogue is putting players off. There's 100 questions for why we're losing all our players over this. But the answer was, when you actually look at it properly, was that it wasn't people who hadn't completed that quest yet, but people who had. So once you have completed the Clarissa quest, there's an 18% drop-off before the next quest completion as per this chain of things. And that's because Act 3 is a complete mess of quests all over the place where none are completed for a very long time. They're these long chains that are going all over the act, which takes an hour, and by the time you're done, you've lost 18% of the players just because it's a much larger gap than other ones. And so the real question there is, A, that may be completely normal because Act 3 actually has a long time between quest completions and you lose 18% of players with a straight line. Or maybe Act 3 being a complete mess is part of the reason we're losing players. Nothing to do with Clarissa. And that was a case of someone looking at a graph and saying, there's a drop, what trouble can I cause as a result of that?
All right. Well. And then like for patches and stuff, do you like how important is data and like every patch and stuff like that, like every new league?
One sec. Sorry, I'm just getting told I have a meeting I have to be at, and I'm just questioning which one it is because I don't have it in my calendar.
Oh.
Yeah, okay. Turns out I have a meeting in 10 minutes. That sucks. Okay,
Oh. I did not.
Right, well, we've got 10 minutes left. Could you repeat your question, please?
No, that's not an important one. I did not know we had a time limit, or I would have
Get to
been
the good ones, Ziz. Jesus.
Yeah, I would have been doing this differently.
That's okay. We don't have that many questions left.
No, we've got like another hour and a half of talk by the looks of it, actually.
Yeah, we do. But it will have been 3 hours by this point, which should be enough for this time. But we can always do another one of these, right? There'll be still stuff to ask.
Trying to think like the most important ones to end with. Health bars for bosses from PoE 2, is that coming before PoE 2?
I want to go with probably not, but I'll talk to the team about it.
Is there any major features from PoE 2 coming in before, like gem changes, etc.?
Okay, so that's an interesting one. The question basically is, we're revamping the skill system in Path of Exile 2, for example. That's not coming in early. That's core Path of Exile 2 content. Yeah. All of the major features that kind of the game is designed around and all of the content are coming with Path of Exile 2's release. Having said that, as I hope is evident, we are piling in as many changes as we can make to Path of Exile 1 in the meantime. Like, we're not pulling punches on that. Our goal is to release a lot of Path of Exile 1 improvements. It's just that the limited set of stuff that is Path of Exile 2 is coming up on its release.
Okay. Will console get something like PoE trade? Trading on console is horrible, and the auction house is hard to use, and will we get some love in general?
Right. So this is a tricky one here. There are two systems in play. One of them is you go to a website, you find an item rather easily with easy searches, and then it's a real pain to trade for the item. And the other one is there's a system which is a real pain to find items. You're browsing through these pages of just random stuff, and then once you do find the item, it's really easy to complete the trade. Now, the problem with us mixing the two together is that a user will use the fast system on the website to identify that an item exists and work out what they need to be narrowing the search down for using the other system to find it quickly there, and then perform the trade. This is something we have tested.
Yeah.
And that's annoying because I would like some kind of hybrid system here. I'm not explaining it well given the time limit. I would like it so that on console you can use the trade website to have access to that entire system. The problem is that when the two exist side by side, it gets too efficient to trade.
Okay. Visual clutter is very rough. Any possibility of a visual filter?
We would rather solve the visual clutter issue than add visual filters.
Okay. Another very popular question. Target dummy for Path of Exile. Sometimes we have to experiment with if something even works or not in PvP. For example, last league, I was trying to figure out if the low life helmet gave damage to the SRS. It did not. I reported it as a bug. Target dummy would fix like a lot of the issues here where we wouldn't have to like PvP each other to test things.
Our feelings are that target dummies are the wrong direction to go for this. We would rather that players have to test their stuff against monsters. It's entirely possible to use PvP as like a target dummy if you can find someone dummy enough to fight against, but yeah, we're not intending to add target dummies to Path of Exile.
What if it was purchasable in the shop?
That doesn't sway me.
Think of the
Okay.
money you make.
What about right now? Both like Path of Building and Path of Exile in game doesn't really give an accurate representation of how things scale, of how much damage you're doing, etc. Is there plans to like make this better or change it? For example, Spectres, a player has no idea how to like calculate anything in game at all. You have to use third-party tools.
We want to provide that information in a better way. Like potentially, we just make sure that the wiki is well populated with accurate information and then available inside the game client or something like that. That's probably the best direction there. I mean, we can add stuff to the UI to make it clearer, but we're already dealing with an information overload. Like some of these skills are already way complicated for new players.
Right.
So we'll find a way of communicating it.
You talked on Exocall about removing some league mechanics from PoE 2 to combat content bloat. With PoE 2 being so far away, will we see any core mechanics removed from the game to combat content bloat before then?
Yeah, we're planning to add Expedition and Ultimatum to the core game at some stage with all the necessary improvements that they need to, be a lot better than they were. And we'll probably replace 2 leagues at that point that weren't up to our standards. And so we are making an effort to stop the bloat by swapping leagues 1 for 1 at this stage, and we'll replace stuff where it's necessary.
Quest
It is
reward.
being prophesized.
Quest
No,
reward.
Talisman's safe.
Yeah,
Talisman's safe.
of course it is. Please buff Talisman.
Talisman's not a league, it's some amulets.
Buff
right?
them. Smart loot comes to mind. Quest rewards during the campaign seem a little off. 4-link in Act 10, etc. Any things like smart loot for quest rewards, you only get them once. They're not necessarily abusable. Or 5-link, any improvements to the quest reward system.
So we don't want to hand out pure power as quest rewards. Like giving out a 5-link as a quest reward is just too powerful as far as we're concerned, because then the only step up you have is 6-link for your itemization, for your socketization.
Okay.
We are looking at reviewing quest rewards to make sure they're interesting and remedial. Like, there's random examples of stuff like, the vendor letting you alch something or various other currency operations, set an item to 20 quality maybe, that kind of fun stuff that you could do that doesn't give you a tradable item. It's just a thing you can do while you're leveling up. For emphasis, though, this quest reward stuff is not likely to be in 3.16 because there's too much stuff going on already in that one.
Right. Another thing, gems, etc. Right now, like some classes just don't have access to every gem. Is there still a room or reason for that in current Path of Exile? So there's not that many gems you're hiding for new players. So it's still like a large amount. But it's often very much more confusing that they just don't have access to things.
There's examples like Templars not getting critical strike gems that we probably need to fix, and we're going to go through and review this. And this is a good opportunity for me to mention that in hard mode there are no gem vendors whatsoever. You've got to find all the gems that you don't get from quest rewards. So the people who appreciate that will know why it's good. You know how awakened gems are fun? It's that.
Yeah, no, that sounds fun for hard mode.
How far have you gotten, Chris? How
What's that?
hard mode viable have you been so far?
I'm just doing early testing with itemization stuff. I haven't had enough deep playthroughs, but it starts soon. Do you want in on the early internal alpha?
I do.
Hard mode enough.
Health bars for bosses from PoE 2. Will that come to PoE 1?
You asked that one already.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
I think I answered probably not, but maybe. I'll talk to the team.
Right, sorry. Any news on PoE Mobile?
No news yet, but we're keen to share some stuff. I have a weekly thing of playing through it a bunch, and it is so polished. Like, the user interface looks and feels really good, so I'm quite keen to share stuff. But there's still a bunch of time until it's ready, so we're holding it out so that we can have more of a splash when we do want to show things. But yeah, it's coming along really well. And I probably should go now.
Yeah, I was about to say, we're probably out of time.
I was supposed to ask about the mobile. Is it going to be playable on PC as well, like as a downloadable thing?
It's the intention is that it's just on phones, but nowadays there are ways of running Android apps on Windows 11 and running iOS apps on iOS, so implicitly, I guess, kind of, but we're not intentionally doing that. Like, it's designed for phones. It's designed for playing in the bathroom.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much for taking time. Sorry that there were some questions we didn't have time for. I wasn't aware of the time limit, but honestly, and I think I speak for the entire community, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. And answer, and thanks to Mathil as well for co-hosting this with me. I don't know if it was clear, but a lot of the things I was trying to argue wasn't necessarily for me or whatever, but yeah, hopefully people got that.
No worries. Thanks guys for doing a great job. Good questions. Thanks to chat for being fun. And I'm really sorry about the time limit. I did not realize I scheduled a meeting, but it's one of those important ones about tax that you really have to turn up to,
Yeah.
otherwise everything catches on fire. So I'm going to go do that now.
All good. Thank you
Thanks,
so
Chris.
much for joining us.
You're welcome.
Thanks,
Thanks.
Chris.
See you later, everyone.